Our story begins with a man, bleeding out and fighting for breath. He reflected on how far they'd come, as laser beams rained down around them. He clung to the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still defeat this enemy. But in an instant, something pierced his chest. He froze, needing a moment to grasp what happened. A gaping hole now existed where his chest had been. He dropped heavily to his knees. That's when it hit him. This was a devastating, fatal blow. He collapsed, face first, onto the cold ground. A sobering thought crossed his mind. He was dying, utterly powerless to change his fate. His blurry eyes fixed straight ahead. He stared at the monstrous, flying humanoid creature, humanity's greatest foe, known as the Liquidator. This unknown entity had suddenly appeared one day and single-handedly obliterated an entire continent. In this dire world, a special task force was assembled to defend humanity against these terrifying monsters. The first member introduced was a man, renowned for surviving a massive meteor strike, without a scratch, armed with nothing but a shield. Imagine that. Because of his incredible feat, people crowned him the world's protecting shield. Brian Miller. Then there was also a formidable great sage, rumored to possess power equivalent to an entire division. She is the great sage Bella Albright. And joining them is an exceptional archer, who once felled a high-level dragon with a single shot. His name is Jacob Bloomfield, the divine archer. Next up is the strongest swordsman who has ever existed, the legendary sword saint, Amy White. And then there was them, a humble group known as the support unit. Corpses were already strewn across the ravaged area. The man on the brink of death, RMC, was merely a foot soldier, Gray Lee. He believed they were nothing more than sacrificial pawns. He watched those elite groups fight, thinking how they operated on an entirely different level. He knew the graduates of the World Union Academy were amazing, but he truly hadn't expected the immense gap between them. The sheer chasm between their abilities was shocking. The elite attackers launched a barrage that struck the Liquidator. It left him reeling. He was doubting the worth of it all. What if his support unit wasn't even there? Amy continued her fierce assault on the Liquidator. She tried to stab him with lightning-quick thrusts. Gray gritted his teeth, witnessing the stark gap. Even after all their rigorous training, it pained him so deeply it brought tears to his eyes. The Liquidator skillfully evaded the blades, until one blade finally grazed him. He was impressed that Amy could even injure him. So he got serious, unleashing a swift, deadly strike that expertly cleaved the elite's body in two. They crumpled as their blood gushed forth. Gray's eyes widened in shock. The Liquidator had shown his true skill. Now that he was done toying with them, Gray couldn't believe he took them down. With a single blow, he realized the Liquidator was just playing. Until then, it pained him to admit that there was no way they could win. He lay there in his own pool of blood, but he was still conscious. Time had passed since his heart was pierced, so it was a mystery to him why he was still alive. As his blood dripped, a weak voice spoke. "I finally found you." The drop of blood transformed into a small light, and eventually it became a message. Gray was summoned to come forth. He awoke, startled, as he surveyed his surroundings. It was a dark place with several imposing stone structures, so he asked where he was. It led him to believe it was the afterlife, though it was quite barren aside from one thing. He also noticed a figure sitting on a throne. This figure exuded the aura of a god, with its black clothing, horns and a veil covering its forehead, and a golden mark on its chest. It bore a calm, stoic face. The mysterious creature spoke to him, telling him he had not perished, and informed him that his physical wounds had already been healed. Then, something occurred to Gray. His injured body appeared on a screen. He asked if the creature had healed him. He declared it wasn't him, but it was Gray's own power at play, leaving Gray completely bewildered. The enigmatic creature couldn't explain it further, since even he couldn't fully analyze Gray's power. But he assured Gray that his power far surpasses anything the Liquidator possesses, but only if he can truly master it. Gray then pressed him if this meant they could actually win. He confessed he didn't know, and advised against getting his hopes up. And yet, He also firmly believes the liquidator must be stopped, which is why. He rose and pierced Gray's chest, preparing to enter him. Then, a brilliant blue light erupted. A mystic circle materialized on Gray's chest. The voice declared, "I shall lend you my power." Eventually, Gray awoke, finding himself upon its bloodied remains. He instinctively grabbed his sword. The sword's tip pulsed with an ominous dark energy. A voice confirmed this was his own power. The enigmatic being then explained that this power of his isn't visible to the naked eye. Gray understood. The liquidator, however, had already spotted him. Without hesitation, Gray unleashed a swift slash at the liquidator. The liquidator caught a glimpse of his face. It couldn't believe that such a strong opponent still remained. A deep scratch now marred its chest. Gray realized his attack had actually dealt damage. Brimming with confidence, he charged again, certain his new power surpassed the liquidator's. But the liquidator sneered, "Don't underestimate me." The next thing Gray knew, he was utterly shocked. He struggled to process what had just happened. His body was sliced in half. Only his lower half remained, with blood gushing out like a crimson fountain. The liquidator commended him for pushing it to use its full power. But then, unexpectedly, a black mist enveloped the area and a hooded figure appeared. A cryptic mask obscured his face. His form seemed to shimmer like black flame. He then raised his colossal black sword. The liquidator stared, utterly confused. It immediately conjured a protective barrier around itself. The black flame was instantly extinguished, manifesting on his left cheek. A chilling gray was already unmistakable. The liquidator demanded, "Is he truly human?" Gray glared fiercely, then lunged into an attack. His sword clashed against the barrier. He furiously tried to shatter it. The liquidator then perceived a shocking truth. His barrier shattered, the sword slicing clean through him. He repeated his question, "Are you truly human?" Gray's chilling reply, "I wonder the same myself." Then he advanced a single step. Gray admitted the liquidator's strength was no laughing matter. He hadn't expected him to still be standing. He began to breathe heavily. The liquidator closed in on him, whispering his gruesome promise, "I'll crush you," over and over, until you're truly dead. But Gray moved first, launching a preemptive strike. The liquidator was sliced open, his yellow blood splattering. He gasped, "You monster!" But he wasn't about to be defeated. Then, an intense light enveloped his form, as he steadily gathered more power. He joined his hands, conjuring a massive magic circle. He declared ominously, "Time's up." Our MC gripped his massive, imposing sword. As he anticipated the liquidator's next attack, Gray was astonished. The day had abruptly turned to night, but such trivialities meant nothing to him. He darted behind him, planning to sever his neck. Yet, his sword was violently repelled by a barrier. Startled, Gray heard the liquidator declare, "It's futile, for within the plane of true dusk, nothing can ever hope to harm me. Therefore," he advised, "cease your futile resistance now, and simply gaze upon the stars." Gray's eyes widened in shock, reflecting the star's glow. It rapidly grew, blazing brilliantly in his vision. The liquidator mused, "Isn't it beautiful?" Like a second sun, it abruptly plunged from the heavens. The ensuing impact was utterly catastrophic. The fallen star carved a colossal crater into the earth, and our MC was nowhere to be seen. The liquidator assumed he could never possibly revive, not if he was utterly pulverized to dust. But his surprise was immense when a portal began to manifest, which then expanded into a colossal magic circle. Then, a mysterious voice resonated, acknowledging the vast, surging power that had amassed. He thought that would be enough to send him back. The liquidator recognized him. It was Kronos. Kronos then addressed the one who wields great power, asking if he could hear him. Having used all his power, he decided to send Gray back to the past. The liquidator, enraged, cursed at Kronos. Kronos told Gray that this was all he could do for him. The magic clock then began to tick. It counted backwards, and when it hit 1, he told Gray. He entrusted the fate of the world to him. With that, Gray awoke from what felt like a nap, lying peacefully on the grass. He was utterly confused about his surroundings. He woke up in the middle of a vast field. The sky was bright and the grass was vibrant green. He then looked to his right, and recognized it instantly. His hometown, Renato Village. He was utterly puzzled. It shouldn't be there because it had been destroyed 15 years ago. Then, a memory surfaced. He had been advised he'd be sent back to the past. He couldn't fathom that it had truly happened. He propped himself up on one hand, but then he saw the familiar wound. He was being picked on by Belder and his gang. This time he vowed he wouldn't let guys like them beat him, but he knew those guys were tough, and he just couldn't beat them yet. He sighed, defeated. Defeating the liquidator felt like a distant dream. He decided to strategize how to deal with them once he got a bit stronger, because he definitely didn't want to get hurt. But while walking through the forest, he unfortunately ran straight into them. The leader, Belder, was the biggest bully of them all. That jerk, Belder, was with 3 other young men. Belder told Gray he'd been looking for him, and he'd had a lot of trouble tracking him down. Gray was cautious. Belder then threw a sword in front of him, telling him to pick it up. Gray looked clueless, which made Belder call him out. "Don't act dumb." Belder sneered. He wanted a mock battle. Gray refused, explaining his injury hadn't healed yet. He thanked him for the invitation, but told him he couldn't partake until his injury fully healed. Belder scoffed, saying he had nothing to worry about. After all, the blade was blunt. But Gray reasoned that no matter how blunt the blade was, it was still a solid lump of iron. It could still severely injure someone if struck in the wrong place. Belder then bellowed for him to shut his damn mouth. He snarled that Gray had no right to refuse, and if he didn't like swords, he could just fight without a weapon. Belder immediately charged forward. Gray was completely caught off guard. He couldn't believe Belder wanted to beat him, even while he was unarmed. Now, it no longer seemed like this was truly intended as a mock battle. He remembered what the military doctor had told him before he was sent back. The doctor had said that the reason his swordsmanship wasn't improving was due to an injury he'd sustained as a child. And reflecting on it now, he could tell that this was where his life as a loser truly began. He deftly sidestepped to evade Belder's attack, but then something confused him. Belder clicked his tongue in clear annoyance, while Gray was wondering if Belder's strikes were always this slow. He ducked to avoid another attack. They engaged in a dance-like motion, wherein Belder attacked, and he expertly evaded. Then he realized it wasn't because Belder was slow. Belder grew increasingly annoyed that he couldn't land a hit. The sword was an inch away from Gray's face, but he moved swiftly to evade it and close the gap between them. He then realized the correct answer. He had gotten faster. The other 3 young men were utterly surprised by his move. They exclaimed that it seemed like he was a completely different person. If Gray went to pick up the sword, he knew he might not have the body he used to have, but he possessed the memories of every battle he'd fought. Belder leapt, intending to slash him. Even though the attack was coming from behind, he skillfully deflected it by swinging the sword. Using his uninjured hand, Belder took the hit, a small groan escaping his lips. Gray hadn't anticipated that. It was enough to knock him off his feet. It made him question himself if it was truly fair to fight such an amateur. But then a thought struck him. This guy was hardly one to pity. He reasoned that it was these pieces of trash who had tormented him because he couldn't fight back. But this time, that wasn't the case anymore. He attacked, making Belder lose his grip on the sword. Belder cursed loudly. Seeing how easily he dropped his sword, Gray realized he was worse than an amateur. He told him he probably wasn't trained on how to properly take a blow from a sword. One of Belder's men stepped in front of him and assured him there was nothing to worry about. As he gripped his own sword, he declared that as long as the blade was dulled, it would be totally safe to beat someone with it. Belder was struck once more. He stared in disbelief as his shoulder bled, as blood splattered onto his face. He cried out, falling to his knees. Gray didn't expect the blade not to be blunted, but upon checking, it was completely blunt. And had it been a sharp blade, Belder might have actually died. He glared at them, then continued to strike. Belder was struck on the nose. He bled profusely, falling onto his back. Gray decided to keep using the blunt edge. He towered over Belder and asked why he was screaming so much. He had no right to do so when he was the one who'd claimed a blunt. Sword was safe. He grinned devilishly at him. Belder's fear began to mount. He yelled at the three young men to stop standing around and beat Gray senseless. The three were scared, intimidated by Gray's sudden strength. Suddenly, one of them suggested they go together. They surrounded him from behind. Gray asked if they wanted another round. Belder ordered the three to kill him. Gray stated he was going to overlook it, but he changed his mind. The forest was indeed disturbed. All four of them ended up bruised and battered, each sporting a massive bump on their heads. Their eyes barely slits from the swelling. They meekly knelt, their weight resting on their heels, their hands gently placed upon their laps. Gray recalled how utterly terrified he once was of these very guys. Then he casually asked them if they were truly from the serious swordsmanship dojo. Belder mumbled that, yeah, it was something like that. One chimed in, saying they felt they'd gotten strong enough already, so they hadn't been going lately. Internally, Gray scoffed, questioning their definition of strong enough. He realized he shouldn't expect much from the dojo itself, but regardless of that, he knew it would still prove useful. Gray wanted an introduction to the dojo, as it was by referral only. Belder quickly told him to ask someone else, because if he admitted losing to his master, he couldn't imagine what they'd say. Gray then dramatically swung his sword right in front of Belder and coolly suggested they should just continue what they were doing. Naturally, Belder freaked out. He bolted, screaming that the dojo was that way. They were all stunned by his sudden burst of speed. The other three yelled at him not to abandon them. Soon, they all entered the bustling city. Belder then asked Gray why he was so keen on entering a dojo. Gray explained that it was because the dojo held a coveted recommendation slot for the academy. Belder confirmed he'd heard rumors about something like that. Gray then reiterated that was precisely why he wanted to go. One of the lackeys piped up, suggesting that Gray was already more than strong enough, without even needing the academy. Gray sighed, expressing that it would be great if there were actually enough. But deep down, he knew that even the world's most formidable lineup was utterly no match for the Liquidator. And even when he unleashed Kronos' power, he couldn't even land a scratch. When it truly got serious, he had no idea how impossibly strong he'd need to be to defeat that thing. But still, he did have some crucial clues. Belder then pointed toward the dojo's direction, and Gray simply nodded. The moment he clashed with the Liquidator, he felt it for a split second. He could control that dark power. And what truly seized his focus then was the swordsmanship taught by the Sword Saint. He thought that if he had spent more time training in swordsmanship under the same conditions as the Sword Saint, then he knew the battle's outcome might have been different. He's aware that was precisely why Kronos sent him there. They eventually arrived at the dojo, and the woman heard them trying to confirm if those bastards tried to pick on a civilian with the swordsmanship they learned from her, and they just ended up getting their asses handed to them. She clicked her tongue. This woman was the swordsmanship dojo instructor, Soria Belder. Belder tried to reason they weren't picking on him, because it was a mock battle. She responded by hitting him so powerfully that he got blasted away and slammed into the wall with a loud wham. The other three had their eyes wide with shock and trembled in fear. She knew he was just making up excuses. She told them that if he calls beating up someone unarmed a mock battle, then it would mean what she just did was also a mock battle. She pointed her sword right at his eyes, while telling him to leave and never return. She told them they could no longer call themselves students of the dojo from then on. They all replied, yes, and scurried away. She sat in front of Gray and apologized. She acknowledged that her former students caused him a lot of trouble. He replied there was no need to worry about it. She thanked him for his understanding, and then she brought up the topic that he wanted a recommendation to the academy. She wanted to apologize for the trouble Belder and those guys caused, but as much as she'd like to write a letter of recommendation, she had to confirm his abilities first. She passed him a sturdy wooden sword. Gray took hold of it. She offered him the first move and dared him to approach when he was ready. He launched straight into an attack. She began to evaluate his every move. His swordsmanship, she observed, was remarkably practical, especially considering his age. As if he'd already faced countless battles. She attacked, and he masterfully deflected it. It dawned on her that Beldur and the others were absolutely no match for him. She could tell his style was mostly self-taught. Yet, occasionally, his swordplay seemed to echo academy techniques. This made her wonder if he'd been taught by someone. His swordsmanship was still rough, she observed, but she acknowledged his raw talent, which led her to conclude that he was a true diamond in the rough. It was almost time to wrap things up. She attacked, and he prepared to strike back. Their swords clashed, escalating their exchange. She found it strange that he wasn't faltering at all, and Gray could definitely keep pace with her. She had only meant to test his skills slightly. Yet, she was being pushed to her limits, and she questioned the unsettling feeling within her. It was fear. Gray was making her feel scared. He swung his sword with immense power, making her involuntarily step back. She dismissed it as just a wild swing. In that instant, she spotted his weakness. She seized the opportunity to attack and resolved to end their match right there. But she was caught completely off guard, utterly puzzled. Saria's wooden sword had been cleanly cut in half. This left Gray equally as shocked, because he'd felt that exact sensation before, leading him to believe he still had that power. But it came with a heavy drawback. An immense pain surged through his body, forcing him to drop straight to his knees. Saria anxiously asked him what was wrong. He then realized his body couldn't keep up with such power. His legs were trembling, yet he stood up, claiming he was fine, even though he could barely stand. He made a mental note not to use his power so carelessly. He considered telling Saria all about it. Saria, on the other hand, was utterly bewildered by his intense stare. He decided against telling her, knowing full well that even if he did, she'd likely never believe a word. So, he simply opted to make an excuse, claiming he just got carried away. Deep inside, though, Saria knew it was utterly impossible to cut her sword with a dull, wooden practice sword, and she was fully aware that he knew it too. Noticing her intense gaze, he couldn't help but ask what was wrong. Saria clearly understood that. He had no intention of discussing what just transpired. After a moment of contemplation, she finally brought up the topic of what he wanted, a recommendation to the academy. He responded that he'd heard she could indeed provide one. She then replied that she could give him a recommendation to the kingdom's finest educational institution, the prestigious Royal Academy of Swordsmanship. However, she wouldn't recommend him for that place, as she believed he wasn't suited for it. Her words struck him hard. It only confirmed his deepest insecurity, his lack of strength, especially since he could barely do anything except for that singular, fleeting moment. But Saria then told him there was another place he should set his sights on, the esteemed World Union Academy. Gray's eyes widened in utter shock as she spoke. What Saria meant was that he shouldn't just be the kingdom's best. He belonged in the world's absolute top institution. His mind was absolutely blown. He was well aware it was the very place where the sword, saint, and countless legends had originated. He then asked, could someone like me truly be accepted there? Surprisingly, she replied that it was impossible. She knew he recognized it himself. His body was far from fit enough to properly wield a sword. She was aware that if it were the Royal Academy, he might be able to fake it with his skills, but it would never pass at the World Union Academy. She then questioned how he'd acquire such skill with his feeble body. He knew she was right. He knows full well that every student from that academy is a genuine monster, and with his current physique, he wouldn't even stand a chance. He looked visibly saddened by this. Saria saw his expression and asked why he was giving up. She pointed out that there were still 9 months until the entrance exam. He reasoned that 9 months simply wasn't enough time. She agreed that it might not be sufficient, but urged him to trust her. She then asked if he was ready to suffer over the next 9 months. He replied that he absolutely didn't want to suffer, but he was determined to do it. He entrusted her to whip him into shape over the coming 9 months. RMC's answer clearly pleased her. With that, her entire demeanor shifted, which completely caught Gray off guard. A devilish grin spread across her face as she declared it would be the beginning of his personal hell. Days turned into weeks as he underwent rigorous training with her. He trained relentlessly, Gray consumed both delicious and, let's just say, questionable meals. He sparred fiercely with her and continually honed his swordsmanship. Our protagonist was dead set on making it to the entrance exam on time. 8 months later, the changes were truly remarkable. Saria observed his newly sculpted physique and realized she had nothing left to teach him. She encouraged him to venture out with newfound confidence. He, however, looked puzzled, since there was still a whole month until the exam. She explained that taking an exam in an unfamiliar place would be anything but easy. That's why it was best he arrived early. She handed him money for the trip and a month's worth of provisions. He hesitated to take it, also thinking that arriving a month early was far too soon. He half-jokingly suggested she was just chasing him out of the village. She casually replied he was simply overthinking things. But then he brought up the topic of an ogre's nest, recently found near the village. That news clearly surprised her. He then added that there were barely any guards left in the village. She tried to play it cool, telling him it had nothing to do with either of them. She assured him that aid from the royal capital was on its way, so they had absolutely nothing to fear. She urged him to head to his exam without a single worry, but he could tell she was lying. He knew no help would ever reach their village, and right before the village's destruction, his master would tragically lose her life. In his past life, news broke that she had been killed when she ventured out to slay the ogre alone. Yet, he simply replied that he understood her intentions. He thanked her and informed her he was leaving. She smirked, wishing him luck on his exam. Later that night, skeletons were gruesomely displayed on a tree, with sticks piercing through their mouths. Saria appeared in the forest. Following the scout's report, she followed a path deep into the woods and stumbled upon a trail of blood. It led her straight into an eerie, monster-filled den, but she halted when a voice called out to her, asking where she thought she was going. When she looked up, she saw Gray perched on a tree branch. He smiled, addressing her as Master. She was utterly surprised to see him. She demanded to know what he was doing there, when he was supposed to be on his way to the academy. He returned the question, reminding her of what she'd said earlier. That ogre nest would be handled by the army from the royal capital. She explained that the army couldn't come due to an unexpected emergency, so she decided to deal with it herself. She assured him that she alone was more than enough because she'd already assessed the nest's strength from the scouts' reports. She revealed the boss was an elite ogre, and the nest held about 40 to 50 monsters in total. She admitted that the sheer number of minions would be a tad tricky. Thinking about it, Gray knew it wasn't that strong, but the ogre's true strength lay in its cunning intelligence and leadership. Gray was keenly aware of the risk of being surrounded, knowing it would be suicidal to fight alone. And he was certain of one critical thing. If he allowed his master to go alone, she won't make it out of there alive, and the village will be utterly destroyed by the ogres. He had seen that future with his own eyes. He insisted he wanted to go with her. She refused, insisting she could handle it alone. He tried to convince her further, saying he didn't want to miss the chance to gain some real combat experience. Then he asked if she thought he'd just get in her way. That made her chuckle, because she knew he was well aware that he wouldn't get in her way, especially since she could no longer win against him. In a mock battle, she reasoned that nobody knows what could happen in a real fight, especially if it's a monster's nest that's suddenly formed. For a dangerous job like that, it's best to wait until he has a bit more experience. In real fights, he understood she wouldn't budge, so he proposed an idea instead. She was intrigued. He told her he'd fight with her, knock her out cold, and deal with the ogre himself. Looking at his stance, it didn't seem like a joke. The dojo was speechless. She eventually gave up, but stated she had one condition, that no matter what happens, he should come back alive. He assured her, and also wished her to live. Under the moonlight, they hid behind a boulder, while spying on the ogre colony. The terrain left no room for escape. It showed their confidence, building a nest in that kind of location. It also meant Gray and Saria couldn't escape either, and since they were dealing with intelligent monsters, he decided to play it safe. She started to observe the colony carefully, and she didn't see the boss anywhere, so she assumed it was probably inside the tent. They could only hope to thin their numbers down. Before the boss came out, she instructed Gray to take out any enemies he could see on his side, while she took care of the other side. Gray agreed, and they charged in. One ogre sent something amiss. Before it could process what it was, Saria was already in its face and slashed its head. The other ogre witnessed the head roll on the ground. It immediately communicated with the other ogres, sending out a frantic signal. In no time flat, a massive horde came charging at them. Meanwhile, back on Gray's side, he was relentlessly cutting down enemies, one after another. He moved with blinding speed, and Saria matched his every move. It was, without a doubt, a bloody spectacle. Eventually, the two warriors regrouped. Ogre corpses littered the ground all around them. Saria praised his prowess. She even questioned if this was truly his first time fighting. But Gray quickly changed the topic, urging her to stay sharp. "We're just getting started," he warned. Internally, Gray sensed that something was terribly off. The ogres were far too weak if they were truly this feeble. He knew his master could have handled them all by himself. That's why he quickly surmised the real danger was lurking inside that tent. A pair of menacing red eyes glared out from the pitch-black tent. They locked onto him, filling him with an unsettling dread. Without a moment's hesitation, he told her they had to leave now. He even urged her to run, immediately. Saria, bewildered, asked what was wrong. He looked utterly panicked, shouting for her to just go. She picked up on his terror, and they both broke into a sprint. But as they ran, something massive leaped right over them. To their shock, an ogre landed squarely in front of them, completely blocking their escape route. Saria scoffed upon seeing the elite ogre. She remarked, "It's an honor the boss himself came to greet us personally." But Gray quickly corrected her. "That's not the boss." Then, another ogre let out a truly thunderous roar. It was so deafening, Saria instinctively covered her ears. Right after that, a colossal swarm of ogres burst into view. They were in an absolute frenzy. Stunned by the sheer sight, she asked, "What in the world is going on?" Behind the horde stood a truly massive ogre. Gray explained it was something far stronger than an elite. He called it an ogre general. It was the true boss of this entire nest, with the elite ogre guarding their exit, and a massive crowd of ogres blocking their front. They were utterly trapped. The ogre general didn't move an inch, but its mere presence was absolutely terrifying. Once she heard it was an ogre general, Saria instantly knew they couldn't possibly win this fight alone. She glanced quickly at the elite ogre, then suggested they take out the one directly in front of them and try to escape. She launched a swift attack, but it effortlessly deflected her strike. She focused, then slashed with renewed intensity. She managed to land a scratch on its shoulder. But to her utter shock, the wound instantly began to heal. Gray told her it was a lost cause. The general's mighty roar was boosting the ogre's strength and healing. That's why they felt unusually formidable. And now, she was struggling to even take down a single one. Gray kept fighting, trusting her to cover his back. He said she didn't need to win. He just needed her to buy him some time. Worried, she asked what he was planning. He replied there was only one option left: to take down that ogre general bastard. And he absolutely meant it. An axe-wielding ogre knocked Gray's sword aside. Our MC got irritated every time they tried to flank him. The ogre tried to make him drop his blade, then raised its axe for a devastating strike. Right now, Gray was focused on taking out every enemy in front of him, but the ogre easily shattered his sword. He realized his weapon couldn't handle the power of a boosted ogre. The ogre swung at him again, and he barely jumped in time. He was glad he had a spare, but he knew it wouldn't last much longer either. Saria quickly realized his dire situation and tossed her extra sword to him. He thanked her. Now he had two swords, but he knew that still wasn't enough to wipe them all out completely. So he focused solely on the ogre general and the horde standing between them. He pulled out the second sword. With one quick, fluid motion, he cut a path through the ogres in his way. One of them scratched his cheek as it attacked, but he blocked the next blow as the ogre tried to push him back with its axe. He clicked his tongue in frustration. Then he pressed harder with his twin swords. More ogres were surging toward him. The ogre general's weapon began to glow ominously. Then came its deafening, earth-shaking roar. Gray flinched as he saw the ogres grow even stronger. They charged at him once again. He realized the ogre general had figured out his plan. It roared again, a defiant challenge. Gray instantly recognized the undeniable genius of it. Steel shrieked as his sword met the ogre's brutal axe. He reeled back, but grit his teeth and forced himself to keep moving. He surged forward, carving through as many foes as humanly possible. He knew, deep down, he couldn't possibly handle them all. Then, without warning, an ogre lunged and tackled him. It pinned him tight as another ogre raised its massive axe high. Gray swiftly slashed the grappling ogre across its neck. He grimly realized they were deliberately trying to exhaust his blades by relentlessly throwing themselves at him. As he fought, a dark shadow suddenly loomed over him. An ogre had leaped into the air, its fist ready to pulverize him. He desperately parried its massive fist using his blade. But the force was so immense, it blasted him backward. Gray coughed up blood, his entire body trembling violently. He gasped for breath, and his precious sword lay utterly shattered. He was now left with only his final, precious sword. He couldn't believe he had to face down hordes of ogres and their general with nothing but one sword. And thanks to his prior experience, a regressor, he instantly knew there was absolutely no way he could win. Then, a desperate thought struck him. Since this was the case, he urged his master to flee, while the ogres were still fixated on him. She looked amused, but firmly stated she couldn't. Saria replied, parrying a barrage of attacks. He demanded if she intended to die in vain here. He swore he'd flee right behind her, without fail, but she simply replied, no. A grim, resolute expression etched itself onto her face, before a look of utter resignation washed over her, as she finally admitted she could no longer run. Her leg had been slashed, bleeding profusely onto the ground. Gray's face turned ashen at the sight. Now, he was completely out of options. His very regression had a singular purpose in mind, to utterly defeat the liquidators. With a fierce roar, he swung his last sword, his mind racing with the thought that this might be his end. His final sword shattered, yet he absolutely refused to yield. He desperately tried to recall the sensation of that power from his past. He knew he had to unleash it again, with the sole, burning purpose of defeating his foes. As the ogres braced themselves for their final assault, he struggled to bring it all back. He tried to vividly recall that powerful sensation he'd once felt. Gray slammed his eyes shut, clenching them tight, and just as the last piece of his blade spun away right before his very eyes, his eyes snapped open, blazing with an ominous red glow. Finally feeling its power, he unleashed his black shadow sword, delivering a devastating, fatal strike to several ogres at once. A mysterious mist veiled part of his face and his blade. Saria looked on, utterly confused, as Gray wore a grim expression. But when his gaze met hers, he offered a reassuring smile and told her everything was all right. With a single, fluid swing, he severed several heads. The ogre general's sword began to glow menacingly once more. But in a mere split second, it was mercilessly cut down. Saria noticed the change, but while she was momentarily distracted, an ogre attempted to sneak up and ambush her. She then realized the ogre's attacks felt strangely weak. She commented that they used to give her such a hard time, but now she could slice through them with surprising ease. She declared that without their general's power boost, they were absolutely nothing. It was already deep into the night when they finally managed to defeat the ogres. Gray apologized, feeling guilty for breaking her sword. She didn't mind at all, especially since he'd saved her life. He gently handed it back to her. She was about to question him about the strange power he'd used when Gray suddenly collapsed without warning. He plummeted face down onto the ground. Saria panicked instantly, shouting his name in alarm. Gray's consciousness drifted into an unsettling, dark realm. He questioned himself. Where am I? Everything around him was utterly pitch black, save for a single, ominous door directly in front of him. He looked around, utterly bewildered and confused. Then, black flames erupted, searing through the chains on the door. He recognized that power instantly. It was the very same power he had previously tapped into. He wondered if if opening that door would grant him that immense power once more. The very thought filled him with a profound unease. Still, he took a hesitant step toward it, but suddenly, a terrifying, suffocating presence loomed behind him. It made him freeze in terror and instinctively step back. His breathing grew rapid, shallow, and shaky. Deep down, he just knew with absolute certainty that if he opened that door, in his current state, he would undoubtedly die. Then, out of nowhere, a mysterious voice affirmed, "You made the right choice." And just like that, he jolted violently awake. He was gasping for air, completely drenched in cold sweat. Saria was startled but relieved. "You're finally awake," he weakly asked. Where am I?" Saria told him he was in the village infirmary, adding that he had been unconscious for a whole 5 days. She then confessed, her voice trembling, that he might never open his eyes again. Realizing he'd been out cold for 5 whole days, he instantly knew he'd pushed his body way too far. Saria chimed in that pushing himself didn't quite capture what he'd actually done. But putting that aside for a moment, she checked to see if he could move. Gray tried to budge, but instantly realized he couldn't muster an ounce of strength. His right arm could move, but only with immense effort, and it filled him with dread. What if he could never wield a sword again? Worse still, a bizarre bruise marred its surface. It looked as if someone had splattered black ink all over his arm. Saria had expected him to have trouble moving it. Gray wondered if she could even see the ominous black mark. He then informed her, gravely, he couldn't put any strength into his dominant arm. Just as she suspected, it wouldn't be healing properly anytime soon. All the bones in his right arm were completely shattered. He was utterly shocked it didn't even hurt. She explained they'd used a magic potion to treat it. That stunned him. Magic potions were incredibly expensive. She quickly reassured him not to worry. The village chief himself was the one who provided it. Gray couldn't fathom why the chief would give something so incredibly valuable to someone like him. She stared, asking what he was talking about, then reminded him he was the village's hero. Gray was utterly clueless. Then abruptly, someone burst into the room. It was none other than the village chief. Gray instantly thanked him for the life-saving potion, but the chief insisted they should be thanking him, his voice thick with emotion. The chief declared that Gray had fought an ogre general, a monster so powerful that even combined troops from nearby towns couldn't even scratch. And that kind of monster had descended upon their village. He clasped Gray's hand tightly, his eyes earnest, and said, if Gray hadn't slain it, the entire village would have been utterly wiped out. The chief explained that without him and Saria's help, there'd be no potion, no infirmary bed, no survivors. None of them would even be here talking right now. Gray weakly protested that he was exaggerating, but the village chief insisted he knew it in his heart. He wasn't. Gray eventually realized that. He found himself agreeing with the village chief, because in his previous life, this very village was destined for ruin, wiped out by the ogre's rampage. The chief then told him, if he still didn't grasp the weight of his choices, he'd happily spell out every single detail. He'd also heard that Gray was planning to sit for the academy's entrance exam and asked if the rumors were true. Gray's only response? Astondo. A whirlwind of thoughts suddenly flooded his mind. He'd slain the ogre a week before the exam, then lay unconscious for 5 grueling days, leaving him with a mere 2 days to spare. His face went stark white as the journey to the academy flashed before him. It was a 3-day journey on foot. By horseback, he could make in just one, but there was one major problem. He had no money for a horse. He immediately turned to the chief and asked if he could possibly borrow a horse. The chief, however, had already anticipated this. In fact, he had already prepared the fastest horse in the village just for Gray. With a ride like that, he'd arrive in no time at all. Saria then playfully quipped that if he hadn't woken up today, they would have just carried him there themselves. Still fast asleep, with a flourish, she flung open the door. The bright sunlight made him instinctively squint. He saw the waiting horse, surrounded by a massive crowd. They held colorful banners aloft, thanking him and showering him with good luck for his exam. Bright smiles lit up every face as they expressed their heartfelt gratitude. Many individuals even stepped forward to thank him personally. One man, stepping forward, handed him a small pouch. Gray asked what it was, and the man replied. It was a collective gift, something the entire village had pitched in for. They'd heard that applying to the prestigious World Union Academy was quite costly. Gray was profoundly moved by their incredible generosity. He offered a warm smile and thanked them sincerely. He then added, it'd be pretty tough to return if he failed the exam. Saria quickly reassured him, telling him not to worry. After all, he's the only applicant to the World Union Academy who's defeated an ogre general. But Gray couldn't shake his worry about his right arm. She reminded him his left arm still worked perfectly fine. He nodded. Saria declared that was more than enough, and he wouldn't even need that power anyway. He argued that the exam might not be nearly so easy. Passing it with just one arm certainly didn't sound simple. Saria reassured him, saying he'd definitely stand out, and the examiners would surely recognize his strength. She was brimming with absolute confidence. She told him, "You will pass." He thanked her, then replied that, with her saying it like that, he had no choice but to pass. In his past life, the village had been utterly destroyed, but now it was still standing tall. Gray realized the world wasn't the same anymore, and that meant the future itself could change, all thanks to his power. And now, he was set for his eventual departure. He made it just in time. He even thanked his horse for getting him there. He gazed straight ahead and saw a magnificent city surrounded by a lake. He had finally arrived at the World Union Academy. At the arena, the host announced they would begin handing out exam tickets until the process was complete. All examinees were to remain inside the central arena. There were a lot of people present, but only 20 would pass. Someone then mentioned that the number of successful candidates changed every year. Sometimes 50 made it, other times only one. The host then called Professor Ariel to the front. She walked in and began distributing the exam tickets. Right away, she instructed the examinees to take the paper that would miraculously appear before them. She then snapped her fingers. A brilliant golden light filled the arena. A paper materialized in front of each examinee. Gray was examinee number 513 under the fencing course. He noticed everyone else had theirs as well. She then explained they would only see their number and course, and reassured them that this was how it's always done, every year. She gave a small grin, then told them that the World Union Academy doesn't judge based on age, gender, nationality, or status. That even included their names. None of those things mattered to the Academy at all. She added that only those who passed the exam and earned the right to cross the bridge will be asked for their name, and even then, they could give a fake one if they wanted. Gray was utterly confused. Even though he'd left his sword at the inn, his paper still said he was in the fencing course. It made him incredibly curious about what kind of bizarre system they were using. Then, Professor Ariel explained. They assigned the courses based on appearance alone. She said if she got anyone's course wrong, they should raise their hand. The examinees were absolutely stunned. They couldn't believe she'd sorted them just by looking, especially with so many people there. Some of them guessed she'd already looked them up. Others thought maybe she used some kind of mind-reading magic. But after a while, no one raised their hand. So she concluded that no one had been misassigned. Next, she announced their exam schedules. She told everyone to check their tickets. Gray's paper said he was scheduled on the very first day. At 11 a.m., he didn't like it one bit. He was hoping for a little more time to let his arm recover. Professor Ariel sternly reminded them it was a one-shot practical exam. If they were late, they'd be disqualified. No exceptions, no reschedules. Yet Gray clutched his arm, thinking he still couldn't use much strength. He silently prayed it would get a bit better by tomorrow. The next day arrived, and he was in a real pinch because it hadn't healed at all. He had no choice but to take the exam with his arm still like that. He was called to the entrance of the arena. He took a deep breath and reminded himself not to be pessimistic about it. He evaluated that his left arm was still functional, and he could move his right arm to an extent. He used the time he had left to carefully watch the examiner's moves, hoping to find an opening. The examiner told the examinee to make the first move. The examinee charged straight at the examiner. His swings were heavy and forceful, but the examiner simply sidestepped to evade them. The examinee yelled, declaring he wasn't done yet. He gripped his sword with both hands and swung hard. The examiner blocked it effortlessly, using only one hand. Seeing that, the examinee's spirit was utterly crushed. The professor then charged directly at him, blasting him away with a single powerful swing. The guy tumbled backward, landing hard on his back. And with that, the examiner concluded his exam. He was instructed to retrieve his weapon and promptly exit the venue. Witnessing this, a small smile formed on Gray's face. He already knew it. He was completely done for. There was no way in hell he could ever win. Not long after, the examiner called his number. As he walked toward him, Gray felt a pang of disbelief. He couldn't believe he had to fight someone who had just taken down a man twice his size. Using only a single arm, Gray was instructed to make the first move. He felt like he didn't stand a chance, but he decided to do whatever he possibly could. He charged forward, recalling what Saria had told him, that a sword isn't swung with just the arms, but instead he needed to channel his power, generated by his entire body, through his arms. Even if his right arm was powerless, he thought of driving the force through his other muscles. He swung his sword, and the examiner ducked to evade it. Gray was feeling incredibly nervous, since he couldn't fight the way he usually did. He thought that if swinging a sword without arm strength were that easy, no one would bother training their body in the first place. The examiner then counterattacked. That's when Gray got confused. Because the instructor's sword was surprisingly slow, he was able to block it. He could tell that the examiner had insane power, but his speed and technique didn't even come close to his master's. He believes that if he relies on the swordsmanship he learned from her, he might be able to make up for the difference in arm strength. Realizing his strength, Gray's eyes sharpened as he thought. If that truly was the case, he had to move accordingly. He then became certain the examiner was much slower and not nearly as strong as Gray had initially believed. He recalled his master's words, a promise that he would pass. Their swords clashed with a resounding metallic ring, and Gray found himself able to overpower the examiner. It was then that a spark of faith ignited within him. He could do this. Their intense sword fight pressed on. Though Gray had already analyzed the examiner's swordsmanship, he charged, but the professor swiftly evaded. This evasion led Gray to a crucial realization. The difference in their raw power was still too immense. He simply couldn't break the professor's perfect form. It made him painfully aware that winning with only one hand would be far from easy. Yet, despite that daunting truth, as their sparring match continued, the examiner's movements subtly grew rougher. Meanwhile, Gray meticulously plotted a risky maneuver. He found his timing, baiting the examiner to come closer. The examiner attacked, exactly what Gray wanted. He needed him to make a wide, open swing. The examiner shifted his weight to his right foot, unwittingly leaving a crucial opening. Gray knew most opponents would aim for a big, obvious strike. But unexpectedly, Gray was already behind the examiner. The examiner was completely caught off guard. Our MC knew one vital truth. No matter the immense power gap, if he could just get behind, he could defeat him. But then, a sudden command rang out. Halt! The tip of his sword hovered barely an inch from the examiner's back. Gray wondered if the match truly was over. He felt it was a little too early to stop now. The other examiner then announced, "Your time limit has been reached." His eyes widened as the final result was declared. It was a draw. Gray felt a crushing certainty he hadn't made it. His grip on the sword loosened, as if his entire body had simply given up. He left the arena, a heavy sense of defeat weighing him down, because he had given absolutely everything to pass. He also knew that if he couldn't defeat this examiner, things would only get tougher from here. He expects his arm to heal by next year, so he'll just have to take the exam again. Before leaving, he cast one final look and offered a heartfelt thank you. 1 week later, inside meeting room 53 at the World Union Academy, the academy head then addressed the professors to hear their thoughts on the candidates. Now that all their exams were finally complete, one professor immediately voiced his exhaustion. An older professor, stated that the current method of everyone observing together is quite inefficient and suggested we divide the workload next year. Another professor immediately countered. They couldn't afford to overlook any talent, simply just to make things easier on themselves. The head sighed, pointing out that he had asked to hear their thoughts on the examinees, and not on the system. He began with the examinees from his swordsmanship course. He asked who passed. They all watched the screens, and one professor stated that, as always, those who beat the examiners automatically passed. The rest would be judged on the quality they showed and how well they held out during the 15-minute time limit. He then asked the other swordsmanship course instructors what they thought. One professor replied that, other than those who defeated the examiner, candidates number 5, 217, and 753 truly stood out. Another suggested they keep the list at that, since even if others joined, they wouldn't be able to keep up with the classes. The professor agreed and asked if anyone thought otherwise. The meeting continued, and eventually the head concluded that they had confirmed the successful candidates for the swordsmanship course. But then someone suddenly asked about candidate number 513. The head glanced over at the speaker. It was Professor Ariel. She asked, "What do you all think about candidate 513? They all turned to watch the screen. One professor dismissed 513 as a little guy. As they watched the footage, it looked like he was going to win, but if he relied on setting up traps just to beat the examiner, things would prove difficult for him later on. They observed that his technique was indeed good, but his strength was undeniably lacking. It seemed he was completely outmatched right from the get-go. The brown-haired professor, sporting a mustache, admitted he just wasn't good enough. Everyone agreed, leaving Professor Ariel utterly speechless. She couldn't believe so many had watched, yet not a single soul had noticed anything. She thought if everyone was truly blind, then observing together was utterly pointless. The very next day, Gray was holding his exam ticket tightly. The results for the swordsmanship course were finally about to be announced. Only 6 had passed, and everyone waited nervously. The first name called was candidate number 5. As their number was announced, their exam ticket instantly burned. Then came candidate 217. Next up were numbers 432 and 615, followed by 753 and 925. And that was it. Gray looked absolutely crushed when his number wasn't called. The successful candidates were told to cross the bridge and finalize their enrollment by day's end. Gray remained utterly downcast, while others around him cheered loudly for the passers. He wore a truly heartbroken look after failing. But then came another shocking announcement. The divine I special admission. Just a few seconds later, Gray's number was called, and his exam ticket burned, this time in brilliant blue flames. Everyone around him was absolutely stunned. Gray stood frozen solid, utterly bewildered. People in the crowd immediately started sneering. It was Gray's first time ever hearing about this special admission. Some claimed the Academy must have cheated. They even declared that the World Union Academy had sunk to an all-time low. Gray overheard every word. He was completely confused since he had no connections. He wondered if his master had pulled some strings, but he hadn't heard a single thing about it. An old man then scolded the crowd for speaking like that about the prestigious divine eye admission. He stated it was a truly prestigious category that had produced countless heroes for centuries. But the crowd wasn't buying it. They argued it was only respected ages ago. They then pointed out recent divine eye picks: Amy White, Bella Albright, Leek Muller, and Jacob Bloomfield, and outright called them all utter failures. Even the current candidates knew the legends, but Gray knew the truth. Those 3 were key players in the battle against the infamous Liquidator. Now, his name stood proudly beside theirs. An academy-wide announcement boomed. The entrance ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. After changing into their uniforms, they were instructed to gather in the plaza, right in front of the main office. Their uniform featured a black path, with the Academy symbol engraved upon it. Our protagonist cut a dashing figure. A few early birds arrived at the plaza, but they weren't sure if it was the right spot, since nothing had been set up yet. Suddenly, a man came sprinting towards them, apologizing profusely for the delay. He mentioned there'd been a mix-up. He asked the students to step back a little so he could place the stairs right there. The students quickly complied and asked if their new spot was okay. The man grinned, saying it was perfect. Then he knelt down. The students were utterly confused. He touched the ground, and a massive magic circle erupted. The very ground began to shift and rumble. The students' jaws dropped to the floor. They watched in awe as an entire structure rose, right there before their eyes. The man apologized once more for the delay and told them to grab any seat they liked. The students were utterly spellbound. They realized it was teleportation magic, but they couldn't believe something that massive could be teleported. Gray sat down, pondering to himself. The school probably wanted the ceremony held in a spot where the building could be clearly seen. To him, it felt like an extravagant use of teleportation magic. He definitely looked excited by it all. After realizing how powerful the world Union Academy truly was, the students noticed there were far too many seats. Only 30 students had been accepted, so it seemed utterly unnecessary to have so many. The girl she was talking to looked surprised. She didn't know why she apologized, explaining that aside from sword training, her knowledge didn't extend much further. The girl readily offered an explanation. She explained that, as the name implies, this academy unites the world's most talented students. She then pointed towards something high in the sky. The other girl gasped in shock, seeing aircraft and even dragons soaring above. "What are those?" she exclaimed. Gray was utterly astonished to spot the magic airship, the Strato Queen. He'd boarded it one other time, back when he joined the Liquidator Subjugation Squad. People said it was one of the grandest airships in the entire world, and he couldn't believe they were using it purely for an entrance ceremony. The World Union Academy was certainly exceeding all of Gray's expectations. The airship touched down, and the students began to disembark. With everyone now gathered, the entrance ceremony was ready to commence. Finally, the headmaster's speech droned to an end. Gray looked incredibly bored, mentally noting, this entrance ceremony isn't so different from a normal one. Up next on the agenda were greetings from the top students of each course. Leon Hart, the premier student of the swordsmanship course, was called to the front as he rose from his seat and began making his way onto the stage. The students whispered excitedly about him. They'd heard he defeated his examiner in an instant during the entrance exam. Some even went so far as to say that he's as skilled as any of the professors in the art of swordsmanship. This remarkable student is Leonard Apius. Gray observed him closely. Just before he reached the mic, he confirmed with the academy heads whether he was permitted to speak his mind. They assented, and he offered a polite thank you. He then boldly declared he had a single complaint he wished to address to the academy. But before he continued, he made sure to greet his fellow students and all who were admitted into the academy through proper channels. He proudly stated that it was an honor to have been admitted to the academy, along with the rest of them. He urged them to graduate as individuals who could make meaningful contributions to the world. He then encouraged them to work together. He then added that he eagerly anticipated the days when they could aim for the top together as students of the prestigious World Union Academy. But he quickly expressed that among them were some who absolutely didn't deserve their place. He then asked Professor Ariel if he was correct. Caught off guard, she stated that all the students present had passed rigorous exams, and though they might not be as strong as him, she didn't think excluding them was a wise idea. She then asked him why he was questioning her. Leon Hart glared, asserting that he wasn't referring to those admitted by properly passing the exams. He clarified that he meant the students she had backdoored into the divine eye through special admission. He then dared the specially admitted student to reveal themselves, ordering them to return their uniform and leave the academy. An undeniable tension filled the air. Gray couldn't grasp why he was so hostile. He then recalled that Leon Hart was sitting right next to him. He was relieved Leon Hart didn't know his face, thinking he wouldn't get caught up in this if he didn't step forward. Professor Ariel acknowledged that the students for the year were quite lively. Leon Hart felt utterly dismissed and ignored. He called her out, telling her to stop letting students in. through the back door. She didn't say much at first. Then in the blink of an eye, she leaned in and whispered in his ear, asking if he truly thought he was stronger than that kid. Her unexpected move shocked the entire arena. Leon Hart was completely caught off guard. He gritted his teeth, firmly saying yes, then asked if she was trying to prove him wrong. Professor Ariel, impressed by his confidence, suggested a bet that instantly piqued his interest. She bet both her job and the kid's admission. Gray was utterly confused by the unfolding events. Leon Hart turned to Professor Ariel and asked if she was trying to make him fight the special admission kid. Professor Ariel calmly replied that she'd never do something so utterly boring. She then added that if Gray truly went all out, Lanehart wouldn't stand a chance and would die. As a responsible teacher, she declared she'd never put their precious lives in such grave danger. Lanehart's veins practically bulged with rage. He felt utterly insulted by her words, but she merely stated she was simply delivering the facts. Instead, she proposed a much safer option, a bet involving monsters. She explained Leon Hart was far more adept at fighting monsters than actual people. Anyway, he glared fiercely at her, but had to admit she knew him surprisingly well. He then demanded to know the actual stakes of this bet. She explained it quite simply. Each of them would face off against a monster she personally picked. The monsters would progressively grow stronger with each round. Whoever fails to defeat their assigned monster first would lose the stakes. If Gray lost, Professor Ariel would be forced to retire, and the special admission students would face expulsion. But if Leon Hart lost, he'd have to do absolutely anything she commanded. Then she coolly asked if he was truly in. Leon Hart wanted to know exactly what kind of monsters they'd be facing. He was confident in his formidable skills, but he certainly didn't want to get caught in anything bizarre. After a brief moment of thought, she revealed their very first target, an ogre general. She then teasingly asked if that was perhaps too easy for him. The entire class was absolutely stunned, but Gray didn't react. Instead, he was purely curious why she had chosen that specific monster. Leon Hart, on the other hand, was absolutely furious. He shouted that an ogre general was not something a single person could defeat alone. Professor Ariel calmly clarified that they didn't have to tackle it immediately. They would be granted a full year to prepare. Leon Hart snapped back. If someone could solo a disaster-level monster in just 1 year, people wouldn't be suffering like this in the first place. He yelled at her to pick something far more realistic. Gasping for breath, he paused, and then the truth of her plan dawned on him. He believed she was purposely picking an impossible task, just so there'd be no clear winner. But with absolute confidence, he declared he wasn't playing along. Ariel smirked, adding one final condition: if the match ended in a draw, then Leon Hart would be declared the victor. Basically, if Gray failed to defeat the ogre general, she would be fired, and all the special students would be expelled. She asked him what he thought about that. He looked at her like she was absolutely bonkers. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the bet was already stacked against him. She took his silence as agreement. Just to be clear, he said, it better not be a weakened ogre general, or anything like that. She calmly replied, of course. Then, with a graceful flick of her hand, a feather pen appeared out of thin air. She told him the terms were already etched in a magic contract. He could sign it if he had no objections. He read the contract and chose to go through with it. Still, he just had to ask, did she really believe that kid could win? Her answer was vague. She simply said, who knows? Then she quietly returned to her seat. The other professors whispered among themselves, wondering what in the world was wrong with her. Some thought she was just using the bet as an excuse to retire. It wasn't too far-fetched. She was past her prime, after all. Gray had no choice now. The bet was official, but something still bugged him. Why did she include the one he defeated before enrollment, when she said the time frame was a full year? She then watched our MC in silence. Gray realized the bet was already sealed the moment it started as he stared at her. She put a finger to her lips, telling him to stay quiet. That's when Gray knew she played dirty. Eventually, the opening ceremony ended, and everyone went to their assigned classes. The first subject was basic magic. It was surprising to some that the lecture started right away. on day one, but as Academy students, they had to understand every single day mattered. The professor kicked off the lesson by teaching them how to use magic. It was the most basic topic. He explained that the body holds a hidden energy, called ether, by guiding it through the body's magic circuits. He continued writing and explaining on the board. Gray was in that class, and at first, he worried he might not keep up. But it turned out, he already knew this lesson from boot camp. So far, so good. But there was one big problem. Out of all the possible classes, he ended up in the same one as Leonhardt. He silently prayed. Leonhardt wouldn't find out he was the Divine Eye, the special admissions student. The professor noticed Gray looking uninterested. He scolded him for already looking away. Just 5 minutes into the lecture, Gray was shocked he got caught with just a glance. Even though he was seated all the way in the back, he quickly apologized. The professor challenged him. If he looked that confident, why not prove it in front of the class? He even taunted him by expecting him to be able to use basic magic. Gray politely explained that, since they were in the swordsmanship course, he thought it was okay if they couldn't use magic. The professor replied that, even if you mainly use a sword in combat, it's still important to understand the basics of magic. At the very least, to coordinate with mages, knowing basic spells, and understanding how they feel is essential. Gray didn't expect the professor to give the same explanation as the one from boot camp. He wondered if the spell they'd be learning would also be the same. So, he asked if they were going to learn Ether Bullet. The professor raised an eyebrow and asked if he could already use it. Gray said yes. He felt relieved. At least the painful boot camp hadn't been a waste. Seizing the opportunity, the professor decided to arrange a match. He knew Leonhardt, who he often called Leon, could also wield an ether bullet. Leonhardt readily confirmed this fact. He then added that even before joining the academy, he had rigorously trained in both swordsmanship and magic, which, in his expert opinion, made it incredibly risky for any other student to face him seriously in combat. But the professor remained completely unconcerned. He countered that even with a vast difference in skill, they were merely exchanging ether bullets. It's not like anyone would actually die from it. And he certainly didn't plan on asking Leonhardt to hold back his power either. That's when the professor dropped a bombshell. He dramatically revealed that Gray was the Divine Eye student for this entire year. All eyes immediately swiveled to stare at Gray. Gray knew instantly that he was in deep trouble. The professor's grin widened, evil as a devil's, as he exposed Gray's secret to everyone. Leonhardt's response was chillingly cold. He declared he would show Gray how things really work and the true nature of the academy itself. Leonhardt glared intensely at Gray, then ordered him to step forward. The two rivals stood face to face. The professor explained that once he gave the signal, they would unleash their ether bullets at each other. Gray had only just begun training in magic mere days ago, during their intense boot camp. And even though the professor claimed it wouldn't be fatal, Gray knew deep down he likely wouldn't walk away from this unscathed. The professor then gave the official signal to begin. Leonhardt was dead set on proving his overwhelming strength. Gray had no other choice. He decided to simply go for it. Leonhardt unleashed a small, baby blue orb of light. But when Gray cast his spell, a massive, glowing blue orb materialized before him. What happened next left everyone absolutely stunned. Their faces froze in disbelief. Even our MC couldn't believe it. Gray's ether bullet completely overpowered Leonhardt's. It sent Leonhardt recoiling with a piercing shriek. The professor immediately intervened, quickly forming a protective barrier in front of Leonhardt. He was relieved, thinking he had saved him. But to everyone's absolute shock, the barrier shattered. It utterly disintegrated, blasting Leonhardt far away. It unleashed a powerful gust of wind and a blinding flash of light. Other students were caught in its wake too. Leonhardt let out a piercing scream as he violently crashed to the floor. The professor immediately rushed to his side, asking if he was all right. Leonhardt stood up, insisting he was fine. The professor let out a relieved sigh. Then, his gaze snapped to Gray. He realized, had the barrier not weakened, Leonhardt could have died from the impact. But even more shocking than that, None of the professors could produce an ether bullet anywhere near that strong. He turned to Gray, demanding, "What did you just do?" Gray was utterly confused. Leonhardt's ether bullet had felt so weak. It didn't even seem like the same spell, which made him wonder, was the ether bullet he'd learned during his time in the subjugation squad different from the one taught at the academy? He wondered if he had perhaps used the wrong spell. The professor said, no, it was definitely an ether bullet, but he added that Gray's was of a completely different quality. It wasn't made from just regular ether. It was super compressed ether. The other students had never even heard of anything like that. The professor then admitted it was a kind of power even they struggled to control. Yet somehow, Gray not only produced it, but he shaped it into a spell. He declared there was no one else in the entire academy who could pull that off. The students started whispering. It was the first time they'd ever seen an ether bullet that powerful. Some of them now believed the divine eye admission existed for this exact reason, while others said Gray should have been placed in the magic course from the very beginning, instead of being admitted as a mere special case. But in Gray's mind, something just didn't feel right. All the spells he'd learned at the subjugation squad boot camp were just like that, and even among his own group, he wasn't considered particularly talented. He asked the professor if he was just joking, because with enough practice, anyone should be able to do something like that. The professor absolutely burst out laughing. Gray just stood there, utterly confused, especially when the professor laughed even louder. Then, completely out of nowhere, the professor grabbed him by the shoulders, stepped right into his personal space, and practically demanded he transfer to the magic course. He even offered to personally vouch for Gray. According to the professor, Gray was far more gifted in magic than in swordsmanship. Gray politely declined, saying he had always been told he wasn't good at magic. The professor stared at him like that was the single funniest joke he had ever heard. He couldn't believe Gray, someone who understood the ether compression technique well enough to create super compressed ether, thought he lacked talent. He called Gray a once-in-a-generation genius, someone even the academy would hail as a true prodigy. He added that whoever told Gray he had no magical talent clearly had no idea what they were talking about. Then he asked again, was Gray really sure he didn't want to switch to the magic course? The professor was known for rarely handing out compliments, so the students were absolutely stunned. They couldn't believe he was praising someone this much. He kept pressuring Gray, saying that if someone like him didn't study magic, it would be a monumental loss for the world, and even called it a crime against magic itself. Gray let out a nervous laugh. Then something clicked. He suddenly remembered where he had actually heard about the ether compression technique before. In his previous life back at boot camp, someone once explained that in the old days, people didn't even know that ood, also called life force, existed. Because of that, casting proper magic was incredibly difficult. They had to keep compressing ether inside their bodies and hope that a bit of it would randomly mix with ood by pure chance just to create a usable spell. A woman with baby blue hair and golden eyes had called that entire process laughable. Now, in the present, Gray asked the professor if he had ever heard of ood. The professor looked utterly confused, and that reaction, it confirmed everything. This world was still completely unaware of its existence. A huge realization dawned on Gray. What he'd learned with the subjugation squad was actually knowledge from the future. He knew he had to be incredibly careful about who he confided in. The professor then circled back to the topic and asked Gray once more if he'd be willing to transfer to the magic course. Gray gave a respectful bow and politely apologized. He explained that his heart truly belonged to swords. As grateful as he was for the generous offer, he had to decline. The professor accepted his decision gracefully, but he told Gray that if he ever had a change of heart, he was always welcome to come to him anytime. Gray thanked him with sincere gratitude. Then, the professor told him to return to his seat. He also added that from now on, he wouldn't scold Gray for looking bored in class, or even for leaving early, because he knew full well this lecture was far too basic for someone of Gray's caliber. The other students were absolutely stunned. They couldn't believe Professor Carlos actually thought so highly of Gray. Meanwhile, Leon Hart watched him intently. He clutched his chest, his cheeks turning a delicate shade of pink, as he gazed at Gray with pure adoration. He even called him Lord Gray. Gray felt an icy chill run down his spine. It was honestly more than a little creepy. Later that day, Gray received a letter from Professor Ariel, asking him to come to her office after class. The sudden summons caught him completely off guard. He wondered if it had something to do with Professor Carlos, he guessed. She might also be planning to recommend. He switched to the magic course. When he reached her office, he stood in front of the door. Before he could even knock, Professor Ariel called out from inside, saying it wasn't locked. He walked right in, but then he was suddenly attacked. He quickly drew his sword and blocked the attack with surprising ease. The girl who struck at him was absolutely stunned. Gray realized he had reacted purely on instinct, but he still needed to know, why had she attacked him? Then he got a good look at her face and was shocked. She looked familiar, like someone he had seen before. Someone from across the table said that he did great. It was Professor Ariel, and Gray had just proven that her eyes were right. The man on the side asked if Bella wasn't holding back. He had to confirm if she had received an instruction from Ariel. To go easy, her movements were flawless, but to have her sword be knocked out of her hand so easily was unnatural. Hearing her name, Gray had confirmed that she really was Bella Albright. She was the Grand Sorceress. Ariel couldn't believe that those two men were seriously saying those things. She suggested that if they couldn't tell if Bella was holding back or not, they should quit as a professor. The professor replied that they were just joking. Since he lost, he gave her the coins. Gray had to ask what they were doing. Ariel replied that they were betting on whether he can fend off Bella's surprise attack or not, and thanks to him, she made a good amount of money. Then she threw him his share. His jaw dropped upon seeing the gold coin. It was worth a fortune, and the other professor started saying that it was just as she said. They noticed that from that exchange earlier, Gray deliberately didn't use his dormant arm, almost as if he was trying to protect his immobile arm. One professor speculated if it was from an injury. The other thinks that, rather than an apparent physical injury to the muscles, it was more like a deeper kind of wound. The professor agreed that a simple injury wouldn't cause that. Gray couldn't believe that. They could tell it just from looking. The professors replied that if they couldn't tell that much, they wouldn't be professors in the academy, though Professor Ariel was already aware about it. During the exam, Professor Ariel told them to leave. Now that they understand, she told them that he's her student and she won't give him up. The professors admit Gray shows incredible potential, but if his wound doesn't heal, he still won't meet the academy's strict admission standards. Before they left, they told him to remember that, then vanished. With those nuisances gone, Professor Ariel finally brought up magic. They had a private conversation over tea. She'd heard he used super compressed ether in Professor Carlos's class. He didn't expect her to already know. She replied that Carlos came to her office, asking her to transfer Gray to the magic course. She obviously declined because, to her, he's much more suited for the sword than magic. RMC never expected to hear that from her. She added that he doesn't look skilled at magic compression and showed no signs of practicing it. He was overwhelmed that she just knew by looking. Because of that, he decided not to lie. It was just as she said. She then asked what trick he used. She promised not to divulge it to anyone and would even give him a reward. She truly needed to know for Bella's sake. He was practically a sorceress. Professor Ariel explained Bella was a genius when it came to magic theory, but she was far from the best at wielding it. For some reason, she just couldn't master ether compression. That's why she couldn't create super compressed ether. Gray had heard before that Bella was a late bloomer. Professor Ariel then continued, saying, from what she'd heard from Professor Carlo, that when Gray used super compressed ether, he didn't look like he compressed ether at all. So if there's a way to use super compressed ether without actually compressing it, then Bella won't have to be sent to Professor Varian. Gray instantly recognized that name. He asked if she meant Professor Varian Bradley. She realized he knew him well. It's impossible not to know him, because he's extremely infamous. After all, he's conducted countless experiments on humans, murdering many in the process. And to top it off, he's unleashed devastating magical disasters that have led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. He's history's most notorious magic criminal. Gray was shocked he hadn't been caught yet. Meanwhile, Professor Ariel revealed that if Bella can't create super compressed ether, by year's end, she'd be sent to him and forced to undergo surgery. This news utterly shocked him, because it sounded like such a terrible idea. Professor Ariel readily agreed, though the surgery was presented under the pretense of enhancing her magical abilities. It's actually human experimentation. It hasn't been made public, but rumor has it because of him, some have died, while others were left utterly broken. Bella acknowledged it was dangerous and scary, but she'd be expelled by year's end if she can't use super compressed ether. Professor Ariel confessed she honestly wished Bella would quit the academy, then have that man mess with her body. The magic Gray knew of was knowledge that didn't exist yet. In this era, if he tells them, he might drastically alter history's course. Seeing Bella tremble, he recalled his past encounter with the Liquidator and the crushing helplessness he felt. He realized there was no good reason to share when that hellhole people call the future is much better off being changed. He replied that he understood and promised to teach her how to use super compressed ether. That evening in the arena, he scrawled some notes on the board. It contained everything he knew about magic. He then reminded them of their promise not to tell anyone what he'd just shared. Professor Ariel quickly assured him they'd even signed a magic contract, and if they broke it, they would die. He asked them what they thought of his sharing. Professor Ariel admitted that just learning about OD had already blown her mind, but the magic knowledge he revealed was beyond that. Bella replied it was brief, yet incredibly well organized. For her, it felt like attending a magic class, straight from hundreds of years in the future, and just hearing his explanation alone had definitely advanced the history of magic by 100 years in his mind. He then answered it was from her lecture, from 10 years in the future, but he understood that. It sounded like it had advanced by 100 years. To someone living in their current era. Professor Ariel then expressed that there was a ton of information she couldn't possibly judge properly. She then asked Bella if she thought what Gray had said was true. Bella replied confidently that there was a good chance the theory was correct, and none of it contradicted their current magic theory. Plus, the quickest way to find out was to test it. That was precisely why they were there. If everything Gray said was indeed true, the spell should absolutely work. She handed him the copy. He read it, looking confused. She released a brilliant light from her staff to demonstrate her full strength. Based on the theory, if he remembered correctly, Bella's full strength was said to be capable of burning down an entire city. Moreover, she was allegedly unable to properly control her immense magic output. Before he could even finish that thought, her power expanded, astonishing even Bella, and the very next thing they knew, her power erupted. The concentrated magic burst towards the heavens. No one had ever expected her to release this much mana. It was such an overwhelming power. If she hadn't taken control of the magic a split second earlier, he would have been dead. She had literally saved his life. Meanwhile, Bella was thrilled she'd done it. Plus, she was able to control it too. She formed a massive dragon with her magic and found it so much fun, but she was depleted of ether and passed out. Gray panicked, but Professor Ariel told him to relax. Bella simply fell asleep because she ran out of her ether. She told him to just let her rest. Gray felt a wave of relief. Professor Ariel couldn't help but exclaim that she was marvelous. She put together magic on that scale in such a short amount of time, even while she's asleep. Bella replied it wasn't her that was amazing. It was the theory, thanks to which she can easily create a super compressed ether. In Gray's head, he retorted, but it's her theory. Though, Professor Ariel was relieved that Bella no longer needs surgery. Now that she can create super compressed ether, she planned to personally tell Bradley to call it off. She was glad about that, but even more so, that Bella didn't lose control of her magic. Gray asked about it. She explained that even if variant surgery can increase one's magical output, it comes at the expense of control. Exactly how it works is a secret. but it seems to be a surgery that forcibly breaks one's limiter. It made Gray think that the reason the sorceress in the past world couldn't control her powerful magic was because of that surgery. Professor Ariel pointed out it was thanks to Gray that Bella could now use super compressed ether. With that, the contract was fulfilled, and it was time to fulfill her part of the contract. And the first thing on her list was to use magic. On his arm, when she released her magic, magical butterflies came out too. She touched his hand, and the butterflies flew around them. The magic became stronger, and when she was done, she asked how he felt. He tried clenching his hand, and to his surprise, he could move it. He thanked her for it. He was puzzled, because not even a magic healing potion could cure it. She told him not to compare her nerve, restoring magic with average magic healing potions. Then, she asked if he could move his hand the way it used to. She suggested he swing a sword to find out. Our boy took a step away from her and swung a sword. He was confused at first, so he kept swinging. He felt strange. It didn't feel like it moved as well as it used to. She told him that she has repaired his nerves, but her magic can't heal the wounds in his soul. He pressed her for details. She made it clear he'd heard her correctly. She then explained, despite recent magical advancements, we still haven't conclusively proven the existence of a single soul. Yet, she absolutely believed they did. She could see it with her own eyes. She could perceive his soul was slowly mending. It would heal quite naturally, as long as he didn't push himself too hard. He pondered this, then inquired if he should completely refrain from sword practice. She quickly reassured him that it was perfectly fine to train as he normally would. In fact, she was quite curious. What kind of swordsmanship could possibly wound a soul to such an extent? He found himself speechless. She then observed, there already exists a form of swordsmanship that utilizes one's very soul to wield the blade. She was, of course, referring to Amy White. She knew he was already familiar with her. Gray was utterly bewildered why she'd bring up the Sword Saint. Back then, during that era, they hadn't even crossed paths yet. Sensing his bewildered silence, Professor Ariel wondered if her assumption was incorrect. She explained that the way he handled his sword gave her the strong impression he'd learned it from Amy. Yet, upon closer reconsideration, she discerned a subtle distinction. This led her to believe that the individual who taught him his swordsmanship must have been even more skilled than Amy. She confidently stated, just give it a few more years, and Amy will be every bit as skilled as your master. Gray was utterly flabbergasted she could even conceive such a thing. He quickly responded, explaining that he'd learned his swordsmanship at a local dojo in his hometown. At this critical juncture, he absolutely had to change the topic, because if he allowed this conversation to persist, he might just spill every single secret he held. So, he promptly inquired, was it even possible for a soul to sustain damage purely through swordsmanship? She firmly replied, no, at least not with any conventional swordsmanship. Simply put, there's no ordinary technique that could possibly defeat an ogre general with just a single slash, let alone mowing down not just the ogres but the surrounding trees too. Gray suddenly realized she already knew, of course she would, and all thanks to him. She'd practically won their bet. She then confessed that she'd seen some of the remaining scenes, and they were absolutely magnificent. Not even the most advanced cleaving magic could have possibly done that. This led her to conclude that he used the mysterious power hidden within him. He asked if she could truly see it with her own eyes. She confidently replied, yes. She could see the power leaking through the chain door. This made him recall the door he had seen before. That's not something you just figure out by guessing. So he was utterly convinced she could really see it. She then shared that she'd seen powers similar to his, though she didn't think they were exactly the same things, just a very similar vibe. He asked if there were others with powers similar to his. She replied yes, but also admitted she was uncertain if they were even human or not. She then told him they were called the Liquidators, and just by seeing his expression, she could tell he'd heard of them before. He was bewildered as to why that name was being mentioned in that particular period of time. Professor Ariel realized he did know of it. In all honesty, she didn't think it was that well known. She stated that since Gray knew about a future-looking kind of magic theory, it wasn't all that surprising. He just laughed it off, secretly thinking that it really was knowledge from the future. But no one else realized it yet. She then asked him how much he knew about the liquidators. He replied that he only knew they were an extremely dangerous threat to humanity, and that they had to be stopped before they appeared. If that's impossible, then they must be destroyed, no matter the cost. She replied that he was being a bit extreme, though she agreed they were dangerous. But even so, Professor Varian was intent on continuing his experiments. Gray asked how Professor Varian was related to them. She was confused as to why he even asked. Then she dropped a bombshell, revealing that the liquidator itself was the very entity he'd been trying to summon all along. Well, that was shocking news to him. He had no idea the liquidator was man-made. But then he recalled how the Academy previously acted, almost as if they knew exactly when a liquidator would appear. That's when it clicked. He was alarmed, realizing that the Academy had been involved in the summoning from the very beginning. He yelled that the experiment needed to be stopped immediately, and Professor Ariel readily agreed. But there was a problem. The one conducting it was a professor just like her, meaning she lacked the authority to shut him or his research down. She had pushed the higher-ups to cancel it, but they simply wouldn't listen. Gray demanded to know who these higher-ups actually were. She didn't have the authority to reveal that either. She summarized that unless the orders came from above, no one could force the experiment to cease. He was disappointed that not even a name was given. He realized the Academy's leadership was far more tangled than he'd imagined. But if that person was a criminal, then it changed everything in the last world. Varian's illegal experiments had killed tens of thousands, and he even knew where they were conducted. He revealed he knew where Varian carried out the illegal experiments, planning to catch him red-handed. But Professor Ariel told him that wouldn't work either. He asked why not. She explained that entering an academy, professor's research facility without permission, was a serious crime in itself. And if they couldn't produce concrete evidence, they'd be the ones getting locked up instead. That's why she had to ask if he had proof of Varian's crimes. He fell silent. She continued, saying that if not, then they'd have to put off this conversation for the time being. He realized she knew the danger, and her hands were tied. He simply replied that he understood her position. Then, she quickly shifted the topic to his power. She then asked if he wanted to learn to control it. That immediately piqued his interest. He questioned if she could truly make that happen. She replied that there was a professor at the academy who was exceptionally skilled at dealing with unknown forces. The name was Heathcote Longfellow. He knew that name. The very same person who had trained the Sword Saint. She had expected this to grab his attention, so she'd arranged for him to begin private training with him tomorrow. He was absolutely thrilled by this news. After all, the entire reason he came to the academy was to master this very power. He hadn't expected to find a lead so quickly. The very next day, Heathcote Longfellow attacked him. He couldn't quite believe it. He was indeed receiving private lessons from Heathcote Longfellow himself, but he was baffled as to why they were just running. They were deep in the middle of the forest. Even though Heathcote was far ahead of him, he could tell Gray's mind was clearly wandering. Longfellow yelled that if he had room for stray thoughts, then he should just pick up the pace. He instructed him to run until his body reached its absolute limit. He yelled for him to listen up, before then lecturing him. Only once you burn away every single drop of your physical strength will your soul's power awaken. And as long as you've got even a scrap of stamina left, we won't touch swords. Gray replied, "Yes, sir." He had faith that since it was Heathcote's training, it must mean something, but he also didn't like that. While he's out here running laps, Varian was carrying out his experiments to summon the Arbiter. They continued running while he questioned himself. Should he really be doing this at this moment? Later that day, he reported to Professor Ariel. She was aware it had already been a week of training. She asked, how was it? He replied that it was mostly running and a bit of sword drills. At the very end, he admitted that he felt stronger, though. She chuckled, remarking, that sounded exactly like him. Mid-conversation, a knock sounded at the door. The individual then handed Professor Ariel a letter. She quickly read the letter. Afterwards, her face contorted in horror. He immediately asked what was wrong. She handed him the letter, and as he read it, his expression mirrored her own displeasure. Professor Ariel's letter concerned Bella, who had seemingly mastered supercompressed ether and appeared to have acquired a power that closely resembled it. However, upon closer examination, it was clear she hadn't truly compressed it. Therefore, her new ability cannot be officially recognized as supercompressed ether. Thus, their contract remains valid, and the surgery would proceed as scheduled. It was from none other than Varian Bradley. Gray was furious. He yelled, "This is pure insanity." Professor Ariel could tell. Varian was determined to force her into surgery, even if she didn't need it anymore. He asked if Bella couldn't refuse the procedure. She replied that, unfortunately, the contract was completely airtight, unless Varian himself voids it. Bella's only options were expulsion or the operation. Gray couldn't accept that. She expressed that she needed his help. She wanted to know where Varian's lab was, because if they exposed him as a criminal, the contract would be null and void. He was caught off guard, but in a few seconds, he smiled, then reminded her what she had said. "It's dangerous without proof." She retorted, "We'll find evidence." She placed her faith in him. Thinking about it now, she admits she could have done that already, from the very start, because her eyes had told her that he was telling the truth. The entire time, it just took her too long to admit it. She demanded he show her the way, and together they would expose Varian's crimes. Gray informed Professor Ariel that Varian's laboratory was located in the mountains, near the village of Torowell. She recalled him having an academy, authorized laboratory there. He just couldn't believe that. He was running illegal experiments in an authorized lab. She then explained that there was no better place to conduct illegal experiments. Aside from there, no one would bat an eye, even if he stayed there for ages. On top of that, no academy professor would interfere with another's lab. But as long as they obtained proof of his crimes, they wouldn't be charged with breaking into his lab. Suddenly, Bella knocked on the door. Professor Ariel invited her to come in. Bella reported that she had received the letter. Professor Ariel took it from her hands and told her not to worry, because she would handle it. Bella was about to ask what she meant. She asked if the professor was planning to confront Varian, for her sake. She also asked if she would do it all by herself. Professor Ariel was amused. Then she replied that she alone would be enough. Bella turned to Gray. Gray told the professor to wait. Because he was coming too, Bella wanted to come along, especially since it was her problem. She told them to hold their horses, because they would be going against an academy professor. Not only that, but he was also a lunatic who had repeatedly conducted dangerous human experiments. If he caught one of them, there was no telling what he would do. She couldn't let the two of them go to such a place. Gray pointed out that all the more reason why going alone was dangerous. If he used the same power he'd use to take down the ogre general, he should be able to offer her some help. He added that if Professor Ariel disappeared, he, as a Divine Eye admission student, would get expelled. Hearing that made her flinch, he requested to let them decide their own fate. The professor watched them, then sighed. She could tell that they would still come, even if she intervenes. She agreed to let them join, but with one crucial condition. No matter what dangers they faced, their own safety had to come first. She pressed, asking if they truly understood. They affirmed, yes. Later that night, high in the mountains, they found a hidden laboratory. Professor Ariel, Bella, and Gray stood concealed before it. Bella still couldn't fathom Varian was truly conducting illegal experiments here. Professor Ariel confirmed it, and their plan was to find concrete evidence. Gray also verified this was indeed the location. He reminded Bella that she trusted them, yet she still hesitated. Could they really gather evidence without encountering any trouble? Professor Ariel expected Varian to be at the Magic Society's conference, so he wouldn't be here. However, there was a high chance the entrance would be rigged with traps. Thus, they needed to bust through the sidewall. Bella wondered if that was truly acceptable. Professor Ariel replied bluntly that breaking into an academy's authorized lab was already a crime anyway, so it was all good. She told them to feel free to turn back if they changed their minds. But Bella was determined to go. Before they did, though, she asked Professor Ariel, "Are you sure? You're doing all this for someone like me?" Gray cut in, telling her she was wrong. Stopping this experiment was for the entire world's sake. If they failed, countless people would die, and even the world itself would be sacrificed. Bella asked him what he meant by that. Professor Ariel conceded that what Gray said might be an exaggeration, but she fully agreed Varian must be stopped. She told Bella not to worry too much. She clarified that they weren't putting their lives on the line just because of her. With that, they moved out. Our amazing waifu professor immediately summoned a flurry of magic circles. She attacked the laboratory, making the entire wall collapse. It was an absolutely massive explosion. Gray couldn't help but feel it was incredibly over the top, now that there was a gaping hole in the wall. They stepped inside, and Gray's eyes widened at the sight. It was a horrifyingly dark alleyway, lined with cells on both sides. And within them, people were reduced to skin and bones, chained to the very walls. Some bled profusely from missing limbs or gruesome body punctures. Just by witnessing this horrific scene, Professor Ariel already knew there was no need for them to even bother trying to look for further evidence. There were so many of these unfortunate souls. A mere glance was enough for Professor Ariel to spot 14 forbidden spells, which were criminal offenses in and of themselves. There wasn't even a need to mention the unauthorized human experiments, an equally heinous offense. As they continued to navigate the horrific space, something else caught their attention. It was some sort of an ominous altar. Bella questioned what their next move should be. Their initial plan was to leave with the evidence, but the sight made her ask, "Shouldn't we rescue these trapped people too?" Gray replied that they shouldn't linger there for long, because Varian might return at any moment. To his utter surprise, someone spoke behind him, asking, "Did you call for me?" Professor Ariel demanded, "What happened to your conference?" It was Varian. They were all utterly shocked he was present. He replied that he'd arranged for a double to attend it. In his stead, he had a far more important experiment to conduct right here. Professor Ariel pressed, "What important experiment are you talking about?" He replied that he'd just acquired some fresh materials, and he wanted to use them while they were still fresh. He was referring to the bodies ominously lined up, hanging grotesquely in one of the cells. But then he added, "Though I've changed my plans," hearing that sent a bone-chilling shiver down their spines. He wanted materials with far greater magical potential than the average person anyway. He claimed he had no idea how they'd caught wind of his experiments, but he was certain they hadn't told a soul that they would be coming here. "So, if you all suddenly went missing, no one would suspect me," Professor Ariel finally realized. He was explicitly saying he'd use them as lab rats. Varian calmly told her to relax, claiming her sacrifice would push the very boundaries of magic itself. And since he couldn't possibly let them leave alive, he'll make sure to utilize them to their fullest potential. He was completely caught off guard when a massive fireball nearly struck him. The resulting explosion was immense. Even Professor Ariel hadn't anticipated it. It was Bella who had launched the attack. As the smoke cleared, they spotted Varian. Amused and completely unscathed, he remarked that divine eye. Ariel still hadn't lost her edge. He truly hadn't expected a special admissions student like Bella to possess such exceptional talent. This made him consider assessing the other divine eye recruits as well. However, he then declared that he wasn't impressed with Bella's little stunt. An academy student attempting to assassinate a professor simply made no sense. Bella countered that it's better to kill than be killed, though she admitted she missed her chance. Professor Ariel then informed them they were pulling back. They already have the evidence, so the academy could handle the rest. But of course, Varian wouldn't simply let them escape. He unleashed a dark orb of black flame directly at them. It nearly struck Bella. Fortunately, Professor Ariel managed to block it, but Bella instantly worried for her professor. Varian coldly informed her it was pointless, since it was one of the fruits of his grim research. Gluttony Flame. It casts a fire that devours defensive magic and turns it into fuel. So in theory, It truly can be blocked. The only downside was that it cost a little rare material to conjure. It had already pierced through Professor Ariel's magic barrier. She groaned as she activated her eye and immediately conjured an added layer of barrier. It shimmered into existence just as the first one shattered, but it instantly cracked. As soon as the gluttony flame made contact with it, she urgently instructed Bella to take the spell. Memory pouched to Gray. She explained that if Heathcote saw it, he'd know exactly what to do. Bella then tapped the ground using her staff and conjured a wider barrier. Ariel was confused about what Bella was doing and ordered her to hurry up and go. But Bella saw that the professor's barrier was cracking even more, so she told him to let her take the lead. Professor Ariel then reminded them of their crucial promise, made before they even arrived, that if anything went terribly wrong, they were to prioritize their own lives above all else. She sensed Varian's magic was disturbingly unnatural, and ordinary defense spells wouldn't stop it. She declared she would buy them some time, but couldn't even finish her sentence before her barrier violently shattered. Ariel panicked, but Bella calmly assured her it was fine. Then, Bella's magic powerfully clashed with the gluttony flame. She effectively shielded them all, confidently stating his spell wasn't actually that strong. It just required a slightly different kind of defensive magic. Varian simply couldn't believe what he was seeing, especially since they were the only ones who knew the gluttony flame's specific countermagic. He demanded to know how she possibly knew about it. She coolly replied that someone taught her a new theory, and with it, the spell was shockingly easy. He was beyond furious, utterly enraged by her words. He roared, demanding to know who it was, suspecting a traitor. He vowed that if she revealed their identity, he'd grant her a swift, clean death. She just playfully asked if he really wanted to know who taught her, then smiled and declared it a secret. She subtly hinted that he was a student from the swordsmanship course. Gray recalled their past interactions, realizing in reality he had merely pieced the entire theory together himself. Varian's veins pulsed visibly with rage when he realized she wasn't taking him seriously. He then seized a sinister red crystal, promising they would all be burned alive. He crushed the crystal in his hand, and tormented souls escaped, spiraling ominously towards them. It was potent, dark magic, swiftly engulfing them all. Gray worried if Bella was still holding up inside. She replied that the barrier could still hold for now, but Varian knew her mana reserves wouldn't last much longer, considering her current reserves. He estimated she had a minute at best. Bella urgently requested Professor Ariel to attack Varian, as she had her hands completely full on defense. The professor quickly heeded her call. Professor Ariel's eyes began to glow intensely, and she pinpointed a spot where the dark flame was thinned. She then carefully projected mana outside the barrier. Testing it first, she slowly began to build up her power. She unleashed her lightning magic. It shot out like deadly blades, but quickly fizzled away. Varian noticed their attempt to counterattack, but he scoffed, claiming they're puny. Attacks couldn't even touch him. Professor Ariel found herself in a desperate situation. Gray recalled that her offensive magic was notoriously the weakest among the staff, and given the flame's properties, it must have completely absorbed her spells. Bella desperately asked what they should do. She was almost completely depleted. Professor Ariel grimly pointed out that was precisely why she told them to run earlier. Gray stepped forward, telling them to leave it to him. Bella questioned his plan, baffled. His sword obviously couldn't reach Varian from that distance. He was absolutely certain it would. Professor Ariel asked if he was truly sure. If he used that power again, it could kill him, and even if he survived, his healing arm might never fully recover. He replied that dying alone was preferable to all three of them perishing, then assumed a combat stance. Varian noticed a sudden red light glowing from them, despite being engulfed in black flames. Then, Gray suddenly lunged out. The very next thing he knew, his head was sent flying and blood splattered everywhere. Gray watched him with a grim, serious expression. A profound stillness hung in the air. After his devastating attack, Bella stood utterly dumbfounded. Varian's headless body crashed down, his head rolling away. Professor Ariel was left completely shocked, as it was her first time witnessing the true power. With her own eyes, it was absolutely astonishing. Bella suddenly noticed debris raining down on them. The entire ceiling began to crumble apart. Professor Ariel used her magic to hold the falling debris still, preventing it from crushing them. She mused that what had just happened was far beyond her expectations, then asked if he was all right. Gray dropped his sword, his hands trembling violently, as he replied that his dominant hand hurt quite a bit. It was also numb, but he could still move it. He picked up his sword with his other hand. From that, she could tell his rigorous training was truly paying off. He simply agreed. He knew that if he were the one who used that power, back in the village, he would have collapsed for days, waking up completely unable to move his arms. Now, it only left him with a throbbing arm. That was quite an improvement. He realized his training had absolutely paid off. As he was lost in thought, Professor Ariel watched him intently. She expressed that it was all thanks to him that they were all still alive. She also apologized that he had to resort to that power. He told her not to worry about it. Besides, he was the one who insisted. They had to stop Varian in the first place. Still, she thanked him again, but also requested that, if possible, he refrain from using that power for a while, or else the damage could be irreversible. Her expression was genuinely worried. That caught him off guard. He thought about it, and simply replied that he understood. Then Bella called his attention. She asked if it was magic, since she hadn't sensed any ether at all. She was baffled, since trying to explain that much power as magic was simply impossible. Professor Ariel politely told her not to probe any further into that matter, and she wasn't allowed to mention a word about what she saw either. She asked why, but the professor replied that she couldn't promise that. She would be forced to erase her memories. Bella replied that she understood and offered a magic contract. Professor Ariel agreed to that. They signed a contract after that. Gray asked what they should do next. He was concerned about the experiments, but he wanted to help those people first. He checked, and it looked like they had been put to sleep with magic. Professor Ariel responded that, even if those people weren't in immediate danger, it would be best to take them to the Academy's medical facilities. To be safe, she snapped her finger, and the whole area glowed in golden light. Each person was enveloped in a brilliant golden light. It was a shield protecting them from all external harm, with their protection secured. She beckoned them to explore deeper. As she surveyed the scene once more, the sheer madness of it all hit her. Illicit experiments were being conducted, as far as her eyes could discern. Nearly all of them involved gruesome human sacrifices to produce potent magic catalysts or to drastically enhance a human's magical abilities. She saw no experiments whatsoever related to the infamous liquidator, leading her to suspect that it must be held in a completely different facility. Gray found it deeply unsettling. This was the very site of the incident that killed tens of thousands of people. Before he regressed, he pondered how the mere magical catalyst production could possibly cause such a catastrophic accident. Then he recalled that what wiped out those people in his past life was a deadly miasma that welled up from the ground. Professor Ariel noticed his troubled expression and immediately asked him what was amiss. Bella, too, cast a worried glance his way. He suspected something lay hidden beneath this very spot. He proposed there might be secret passages leading deep underground. Professor Ariel meticulously scanned the surroundings. There were bloodstains on the floor and scattered dirt, but no visible hidden passages. Until her special, I suddenly caught something. She cautiously approached the spot. Crouching down, she meticulously inspected the ground. The traces were incredibly faint, but she could still discern faint traces of short distance. Teleportation magic emanating from that area. She deduced that it was a unique space, accessible only through teleportation magic. Based on the faint traces, the teleportation range was approximately 300 meters. She was certain something crucial lay beyond. Gray eagerly asked if they could reach it. She then revealed that she, too, could utilize short-distance teleportation gates. As she gave it a try, a magic circle glowed brightly on the ground. If there's nothing on the other side of this gate, it should lead to nothing but solid earth. The gate then swung open. What they saw left them utterly stunned. It was a vast area teeming with countless buildings, almost resembling an entire city. No one would ever imagine such a colossal space existed right beneath that facility. Bella instantly sensed a tremendous output of ether, pulsing from every direction within the area, especially from the specific building she pointed towards. It was a deceptively simple circular structure. Professor Ariel quickly realized it wasn't just ether, but an entirely different kind of power was also present. Something completely distinct from magic leaking out there, and it was far, far greater than anything she'd ever encountered. Gray had a sudden inkling of what this mysterious power was. Professor Ariel then grimly confirmed his suspicion. It was the Liquidator's power. Professor Ariel, Gray, and Bella then ventured into the building, only to find an empty hallway leading to a single, ominous door. She then confirmed the immense power was emanating from that very spot. Yet, there was no immediate sign of the Liquidator themselves. At that precise moment, she gave a decisive knock on the door. Then, without hesitation, she pulled it open, making Bella instantly worry they were tampering with something dangerous. Professor Ariel calmly told her to relax, explaining that the door itself held no actual power. It was merely placed there as a symbolic element for a ritual. The true power wasn't within the door at all. It resided in the intricate magic rigs surrounding it. Suddenly, the magic rigs began to pulsate with an eerie glow, with Professor Ariel standing right at its ominous center. Gray, startled, demanded to know what was happening. He suspected she was attempting to summon the Liquidator herself, or something even more terrifying. Bella could instantly tell this magic was incredibly dangerous, so she urgently suggested shutting it down at once. But Professor Ariel calmly instructed them not to rush. Her precise prediction indicated that this setup couldn't actually summon the Liquidator after all. The door suddenly began to crack ominously, and a terrifying void of pure darkness started appearing on the other side of the fracturing portal. Gray instantly worried that the very fabric of space was tearing. Bella frantically called out to the professor. Then, the intense magic slowly began to die down. Both Gray and Bella looked utterly confused. But it was all precisely as Professor Ariel had expected, and her expectations were precisely confirmed. Turns out, those devices weren't actually built to summon the Liquidator. Instead, they merely tore open a tiny rift to its location. Then, they siphoned off the raw power seeping through. The core they used to crystallize that immense power was almost certainly made of human lives. She could sense at least 10 souls had been consumed so far, but the complete molding process might have demanded even more sacrifices. Her grim realization was that most of the people they saw upstairs earlier were abducted, destined to become raw materials. Bella questioned why they would go to such extreme lengths just to hoard all that power. She pondered what their ultimate goal with it could be. The Black Flame variant unleashed during their fight was most likely amplified by this very crystal, and that crystal was the twisted byproduct. After they'd finished processing the power, she also realized that the catalyst wouldn't be limited to just flames. If they managed to mass-produce this substance, no one could predict their full intentions for it. The cracks on the door were rapidly vanishing. Gray then asked if Varian hadn't been attempting to summon the Liquidator after all. But Professor Ariel couldn't tell if he hadn't tried at all, or if he just couldn't as she inspected the magic rigs, and concluded they were pushed to their absolute limits. It's possible that this setup was all they could manage. Bella scanned her surroundings and judged the elaborate apparatus to be incredibly valuable. She had never encountered a spatial warp magic system with such incredible precision and high output. Professor Ariel concurred and then revealed that constructing just one of these would demand a nation's entire budget. But to possess 8 of them? Only one organization immediately came to her mind. Bella guessed it was the Discar Empire. But that wasn't correct. They might be the world's largest country, but they likely lack the magical research and resources required to construct even one of these. Bella pressed. Then who could it be? Professor Ariel considered an organization whose magical research truly dwarfs even the Empire's own capabilities. Gray then realized it could only be the World Union Academy. Bella looked slightly confused. Professor Ariel confirmed that he was absolutely right. There was no other research body capable of supporting that kind of scale or budget. A moment of silence hung between them until Bella finally broke it. She needed to confirm if the Academy was truly behind this, as she could barely believe it. The World Union Academy, after all, was supposed to defend the world from threats. Professor Ariel understood Bella's disbelief, knowing why she didn't want to believe it. But she also couldn't conceive of any other group that could pull off such a feat. Gray then argues that it doesn't necessarily mean the entire Academy is their enemy. He firmly believes that most people there would actually be on their side, because before his regression, the Academy's top forces were always on the front lines, even going beyond the subjugation squads. They tirelessly protected civilians right until the very end. After witnessing that future, he simply can't believe the Academy is humanity's enemy. Professor Ariel pointed out that, just as Gray said, most of the Academy likely acts for humanity and wouldn't allow experiments that waste lives. However, the Academy boasts countless researchers, as well as facilities that hardly anyone in the world truly knows the full picture. And she could tell that whoever was backing Varian had some serious, deep-seated backing he couldn't have arranged. All of that with his authority alone. Bella then realized that they couldn't fully trust the Academy either. Professor Ariel had watched the Academy from the inside for decades. One thing she could say is that it's not an organization they can blindly trust. Most people inside genuinely believed they were doing what was best for humanity. Even the ones behind the experiments had probably convinced themselves that it was for the greater good. She could only conclude that the truth was buried deep in the dark. Gray then probed her for any idea on how they could find the mastermind. She looked around, but found no communication devices. Inside the facility, not a single trace of the Maker's magic remained in the rigs. The cover-up was incredibly thorough, making any discovery practically impossible. But then she sensed something. A deafening explosion erupted right behind Bella. The roof caved in, plunging the scene into instant chaos. She quickly inspected the wreckage and realized they'd installed evidence erasing mechanisms for good measure. But they hadn't blown up the place the moment Varian died, which led her to one chilling assumption. They were planning to lure in those snooping around before detonating the entire place. Bella screamed, insisting it was no time for hypotheses, because they absolutely had to get out of there quickly. Professor Ariel simply told her to calm down, because these were merely magical explosives. She confidently claimed that professors from the World Union Academy weren't so weak that they'd be killed by mere explosives. Professor Ariel then manifested a powerful magic circle and warned them strictly not to step out of it. The magic rigs around them also began to pulse with life. This had truly been an incredibly close call. Luckily, they vanished into thin air just before everything completely fell apart. They had teleported just outside the laboratory, bringing along a few other people. Every captured person had made out safely. Bella honestly thought she was going to die. Gray dryly commented that they were still too close to the lab for comfort. Professor Ariel calmly replied that they had more baggage than she'd expected, which, unfortunately, slowed the teleportation. However, it was completely worth it, as they were able to secure the magic rigs as well. Once they present these to the Academy, they won't be able to ignore them any longer. The night deepened, and on the very next day, they were promptly informed that all the survivors were being treated within the Academy's medical wing. The one delivering this news was the World Union Academy's headmaster, Orodrome Alexandro. He expressed his deepest gratitude to them for halting Varian's illegal experiments. He then brought up the critical topic of the magic rigs. Each one of them is worth more than a national budget. Professor Ariel knew that, and there were 8 of them. She's certain that there was no way he could have gathered that kind of firepower alone. She wondered how he obtained those. He answered that it was stolen goods. They were hijacked mid-transport, and 78 transport agents were wiped out. That was surprising news. Hearing that, 78 transport agents of the Academy were dead. She remembered an incident 15 years ago. Alejandro confirmed that the stolen cargo back then carried those magic rigs. Professor Ariel recalled the one responsible for it. He revealed it was Blood Drinker. He assumed she knew him. Gray was familiar with them, the world's biggest crime organization. Bella described them as parasites of the world that always crawl back, no matter how many times people crush them. Her intense description made Gray glance at her, but made sense when she revealed that they killed her parents. Alejandro confirmed her description, because despite being exterminated hundreds of times, they still resurfaced. No one knows where they hide or who leads them. Some say over 10% of all crime-related deaths were their doing. It wouldn't surprise Alexandro if some of their people were already inside the Academy. What's worse was that there's no way to tell them apart. Even if there was, the Academy wouldn't act on it. That made Gray raise his tone as he asked what he meant. Professor. Ariel replied that it's how the Academy operates now. Anyone with talent get a chance to grow stronger, no matter their bloodline, race, or gender. Alejandro confirmed that and added that it also doesn't matter if they're criminals. Bella yelled that it was absurd. She argued that if there were criminals, they should be dealt with. Alejandro agreed, however. The higher UPS don't seem to share that view. She was confused, because he was supposed to be the headmaster. He replied that he's nothing more than an underling. He revealed he's just the official face of the Academy, but his actual authority was practically non-existent. So he asked them if they really wanted to know who held the true power. Gray and Bella eagerly nodded. Alexandro then explained they needed to become much stronger, because the more power they demonstrated, the deeper they'd be allowed into the Academy's secrets, and the more truths they'd uncover. He couldn't name names directly, but revealed there was an upperclassman with enough influence to shape the Academy's entire direction. Even that wild policy of accepting criminals was entirely his decision. Gray wanted to confirm his suspicions, and Alexandro replied that they, too, could even change the Academy itself, because their strength was everything. That declaration filled them with fierce determination, evident in their tightly clenched fists, their hands trembling. And Alexandro found it quite amusing, because he knew Ariel shouldn't have stood a chance against Varian. Not at all. So one of those two students must have truly done it. He couldn't deny it. Ariel's divine eye was as sharp as ever. He couldn't wait to see what kind of monster she'd train. After that, Gray walked the hallway alone. He checked the mark on his arm, thinking about how power truly ruled the Academy, whether they wanted to take down the Liquidator or uncover what was really going on behind the scenes. They need to focus on getting stronger first. When he looked up, he spotted someone. He instinctively moved to excuse himself, but to his shock, the guy instantly kicked him. He blocked it with his forearms, but was still pushed back forcefully. His feet dragged across the floor until he regained his balance. The person who'd attacked him commented that he was tougher than expected. Gray demanded to know what his problem was. The guy seemed offended by the question, claiming it was Gray, who was walking around like he owned the place. He then sneered that a special admission reject, like Gray didn't belong in his hallway. Gray realized something important. He was one of those who despised the special admits. But this was the first time anyone dared to physically attack him, right there in the hallway. Gray had to confirm if this guy was actually looking for a fight. The guy was definitely up for it, but then rejection number 2 appeared. Gray turned to see who this mysterious person was, and just like that, the guy vanished. As the guy walked off, he spoke to someone, apologizing to them. He explained that surveillance was incredibly tight, so he couldn't get any closer to the target. Then he promised to send someone else there soon. Soon, it became clear this guy was talking to Varian. And just as we suspected, that old traitor is still alive. Professor Ariel then asked Gray what exactly had happened. He replied that some random student had kicked him, all while spouting off that a divine eye, special admit like him, shouldn't even be walking around the Academy's sacred halls, since there were no actual weapons or visible injuries. Professor Ariel couldn't officially do anything about the incident, so she suggested that he just chase him down and punch the lights out of him. Gray was utterly surprised to learn he was actually allowed to do that. She couldn't technically permit him as his professor, of course, but she reasoned that her eyesight had been getting incredibly bad lately, so if something were to happen nearby, she simply might not notice it at all. She even acted the part to look more convincing. Gray found that way too suspicious, so he decided to just leave the guy alone. He didn't want to cause any more trouble. She thought it was such a shame, but she was curious if Divine Eye special admits were truly disliked that much. He told her that some people made fun of them sometimes, but it was definitely the first time it had gotten physical. She realized her students were truly being mocked. She apologized to him. She felt bad not having more authority in the school. He assured her that there was nothing to worry about. If it weren't for her, he wouldn't even be in the academy at all, and he was certain that Bella and the others would eventually prove that the Divine Eye program wasn't a mistake after all. Her eyes were truly perceptive. It rendered her utterly speechless. She flushed and thanked him then. His charm was undeniably potent. She then firmly told him not to act like it's someone else's problem, because out of everyone in the Divine Eye group, he was the one she expected the most from. She believed that Amy White, Leek Muller, and Jacob Bloomfield, like the special admits before then, would all become top tier. For the first time, she truly believed someone could surpass humanity itself was when she met him. He felt bothered that she compared him to them, but he realized that was a weak mindset. The mastermind behind Varian probably hasn't given up on summoning the Liquidator yet, and even those great people couldn't even scratch that thing. He came back to this timeline to make sure he could defeat it. He remembered what he was told. The fate of the world rests in his hands. After that encounter, the swordsmanship class had a live combat practice. The students paired up, according to the list on the board. Gray had to be sharp for this practical training. It was because if he screws up, everyone would start bad-mouthing all the Divine Eye. Admits again, at the very least, he needs to show he can keep up with the regular students. But he was paired with Leonard Appius. He's the top of the swordsmanship course. In other words, he's the strongest first-year student. The professor informed them that he matched the students of similar skill level, so they don't have to hold back and to treat it like a real fight. But Gray thought it was a joke. He wondered how he'd end up fighting the top student when he barely got in as a special admit. On top of that, the guy already hates Divine Eye students. He expected him to be itching to beat him bloody. After the incident last year, someone then caught our MC's attention. Leon Hart approached him, declaring he was thrilled to be paired with Gray. Deep down, he was excited to finally spar with Gray, feeling that becoming top of the class had been entirely worth it. He trained harder than anyone and was eager to showcase his swordsmanship to Gray. Gray's mouth twitched seeing him, as Leon Hart's smile was just too bright. It made Gray certain Leon Hart was absolutely loving the fact he finally had a legal chance to beat him up. Gray stuttered when he replied that he was also looking forward to it. Just look at that facial expression, dude. A few moments later, the professor asked if everyone was ready. The match began, and Leon Hart attacked at once. Gray blocked him with his sword, but he struggled. He was pushed back as Leon Hart swung his sword. Leon Hart was completely focused. He attacked again, and Gray barely evaded it. Then, Gray gripped his sword tightly and counterattacked. Leon Hart blocked his sword, acknowledging Gray's strength. It was hard to believe Gray hadn't made it through regular admissions. They continuously clashed swords. Gray expected to get instantly wrecked, but he was actually holding up. But still, he couldn't match Leon Hart's raw power, even with both arms. Leon Hart's swordsmanship was insane. A perfectly proper, by-the-book style. Gray described it as polite swordsmanship, but perfected to a terrifying degree. Even with the experience from his past life and his master's training, he had to call Leon Hart a monster. For someone in their first life, their intense fight captured the attention of all the other students. They were incredibly impressed with how Gray was keeping up with Leon Hart. Leon Hart felt absolutely wonderful, declaring he could do this all day. But Gray was worried his stamina couldn't keep up. If it weren't for Heathcote's training, he'd already be down for the count. Little did Gray know, Leon Hart was bothered that he still wasn't out of breath. Gray's dwindling stamina wasn't obvious to anyone. Deep down, Gray felt an urgent need to end this quickly. He remembered the professor's crucial advice. Fight as if it's a real battle to the death. He focused his gaze, meticulously tracking the incoming attack. He skillfully ducked beneath the sword's aggressive swing. Then, from his position on the ground, he expertly pivoted his body with a single hand. Leon Hart found himself completely caught off guard when Gray suddenly targeted his vulnerable ankle. Leon Hart was stunned, caught off guard by that move, but what truly shocked him was Gray's expression. He instantly realized Gray was treating this like a genuine life-or-death battle. He tightened his grip on his sword. He fought with everything he had. Losing was not an option. After countless more intense clashes, eventually, these two formidable fighters ended up. Their blades pressed menacingly against each other's throats. Gray, breathing heavily, declared the match a draw. Offering a hand, he helped Leon Hart up, who readily accepted. But Leon Hart countered, actually, it wasn't quite a draw. He openly admitted that in that very last instant, all he could manage was a desperate, wild swing of his sword. Gray, however, could have effortlessly pierced him straight through the heart, had he truly wished, since it was just a mock battle. Leon Hart understood. Gray was simply forced to thrust his blade toward his neck. Gray chuckled, dryly commenting, even with all those powerful protective spells, pointing a sword directly at someone's heart in a mock duel is still pretty messed up. Leon Hart finally conceded, I lost. He sincerely thanked Gray for showing him the true difference between actual life-or-death combat and mere elegant fencing practice. And also, he continued, I've learned that fighting isn't just about mere sword skills. Gray, ever humble in his victories, modestly replied that it was just a cheat move, completely unsuitable for a swordsmanship class. Leon Hart, however, reminded him, the instructor explicitly said, to treat this like real, no-holds-barred combat. So, there's no such thing as cheating in real combat. Which is why, he continued with a grin, I have a suggestion, and that's to immediately have another round. Gray, however, clearly wasn't too fond of that idea. I only won because I managed to catch you off guard, he admitted. If we were to face each other directly, head-on, I know there's absolutely no way I'd stand a chance. At that point, it wouldn't be about technique anymore. He knew the guy's stamina would easily leave him in the dust, but someone intervened. The man loudly declared they were in a sword class, and no one said he could use anything other than a sword. He then questioned how a special admit loser like him got paired with a top student. He warned Gray not to get too cocky, just because he had some magic. It wasn't Gray who arranged the match, after all. Leon Hart stepped in, sharply replying that the instructor had decided. He was the only one worthy of fighting Gray. He told the guy to butt out. The instructor confirmed Leon Hart's words. He reminded them that he paired students with similar overall strength, and Gray was the only one who could take Leon Hart on. Leon Hart proudly nodded in agreement. The instructor then proposed to the other student to try facing Gray if he wasn't satisfied. If he could beat Gray, then he would be Leon Hart's opponent. The student agreed then, told Gray he'd ace the examiner's test to enter the academy. He didn't want to be lumped in with those who barely scraped a pass by a hair, or those who couldn't pass at all. Leon Hart realized this guy was judging Gray by his admission category alone, without even knowing his true strength. He saw his old self in him, but he also thought it would be a good chance to make them recognize Gray's power. More than that, he was annoyed this guy interrupted his time with Gray. The guy noticed his furious expression. Leon Hart wanted to sentence him to death for that crime. The poor guy was utterly puzzled why Leon Hart was so pissed. Since the guy didn't like the real combat rule, he agreed they could only use their swords. He asked Gray if he was okay with that. Gray had no clue how strong the guy was, but if he got into the academy through regular exams, he knew it wouldn't be easy. He could tell the guy had more stamina and strength than him, even with his master's brutal training. He couldn't beat years of proper nourishment. After all the conditioning, he admitted he wasn't confident in his skills, but losing wouldn't get him expelled. The instructor confirmed he was right. It was only a practice class, but he warned them not to go easy. Hearing that, Gray agreed. The moment the signal was given, his opponent charged forward, eager to put Gray in his place. Gray blocked the sword, a hint of confusion crossing his face. He shifted his sword and pushed the guy back. His opponent was surprised. Gray noticed his hits were too light, and his powers, nothing special. Of course, the fool attacked again. Gray wondered if he was holding back. He simply swung his sword, and to everyone's surprise, his opponent was hit and started to bleed. He stumbled to the opposite side, and the instructor declared the match over. Gray got nervous, asking if he was okay. He had been aiming for his sword, but he actually hit the guy instead. He expected him to dodge, but his opponent claimed it was just a fluke, and that he was merely caught off guard. His face was a mess, tears flowing freely, and blood staining his nose and cheeks. But since his ego was clearly bigger than his brain, he challenged our MC again. The other students pitted him, since it looked incredibly painful. The instructor could only sigh. Then he agreed to let them continue, until they were satisfied. He charged again. Time passed. Gray still looked fine. He asked his opponent if he was okay. His opponent could barely open his eyes. His face was already unrecognizable from all the bruises and bumps. His speech was slurred as he replied he was fine. He still tried to assume a combat stance. Given his condition, the instructor finally had to tell them to stop. He then told one of the students to take the guy to the infirmary. After that, he announced the year's representatives would be Gray and Lay. Deep down, he knew. The instructor then asked if anyone had objections. Gray, however, had no clue what representatives were, so the instructor explained. The top first years would face the second year champion in the upcoming inter-year battle. The first years had actually lost 35 times in a row, but with Gray there, he had a feeling that this year, things just might be different. Gray was utterly surprised to hear about those 35 losses. He inquired, "Is the power gap between first years and second years really that massive?" The instructor replied, "Yes. A single year at the academy is huge." He told them that losing was absolutely normal. In fact, it was practically expected. So, if they could even put up a decent fight, that would already be impressive. And if he wins, that would be etched into the academy's history as an absolute miracle. Just being chosen to fight is considered an honor. The professor tapped his shoulder and told him not to stress it too much. He then dismissed the class. Before leaving, Gray realized the inter-year battle wasn't as serious as he thought. Still, as a Divine Eye special student, it was a perfect chance to prove he could actually fight. He knew he needed to train hard. Meanwhile, the faculty had a meeting, and last on their agenda was Professor Budra's shocking proposal. Professor Ariel watched him intently. Professor Budra of the Magic Department proposed Amy White's expulsion. Professor Ariel probed him on why he'd suggest that, especially given she's the one managing the Divine Eye students. Professor Budra pointed out that that was precisely the problem. Amy White failed the third-year advancement exam. In spite of that, she got to stay because she's a special admit. Every other student who failed was expelled. So he pointed out it doesn't look fair to anyone. Headmaster Alexandro remained quiet. Professor Ariel pointed out that, as she'd told him before, Amy was progressing steadily toward top-class status, world-class combat abilities. Since the backlash on her body was so severe at the moment, she couldn't unleash her full power. Otherwise, she totally would have passed. But the other professors were fed up with that excuse. Again, the professor next to Budra declared that this excuse about the harsh physical backlash makes a useless student sound like some hidden prodigy. He scoffed. How long she planned to keep spouting that fantasy about her secret powers. Professor Ariel insisted it was the truth. She believed Amy could gain control any day now, maybe even tomorrow, but if they pushed her too soon, she might lose that chance forever. They scoffed again, that she'd given them the same excuse countless times before. The professor saw it as her letting someone who can't meet academy standards stay there indefinitely. She countered that the academy exists to nurture exceptional talents. Kicking out someone gifted just because they don't fit neatly into a system defeats its whole purpose. Professor Budra, however, doubted that talent. He stated that special admissions used to be impressive back in the old days, but the current batch? Utter failures. His examples? Amy Whittle, Bella Albright, and Jacob Bloomfield. To him, the great divine, I was clearly losing its keenness. The professor next to her then suggested abolishing the divine I program entirely. Professor Ariel was completely caught off guard. She stammered, "What are you talking about?" Professor Budra informed her that it was established ages ago by the Academy's Founders Council, so it could be abolished the very same way. If over half of the faculty agreed to the idea, some professors chimed in, saying the current divine eye students didn't impress. They noted Bella Albright's improvement, but it was no major achievement. Not to mention, her mana capacity was still questionable. Professor Ariel was utterly speechless. An older professor also pointed out that, even though the old divine eye students were once a force to behold, but the recent batch, however, just didn't measure up, and everyone agreed. They simply lacked the awe-inspiring power they once commanded. She scanned the room, her gaze falling on professors with smug smirks, while the others looked increasingly swayed. The opposition against the divine I was far greater than she'd ever anticipated. At this rate, the program truly faced the threat of being shut down. Professor Budra then vehemently argued that the program had been obsolete for far too long, and it was time for them all to simply move on. He then directly challenged Professor Ariel, asking if she still genuinely believed she could judge talent better than any of them could hope to. Ariel remained utterly silent. So he mockingly declared that the cat had certainly got her tongue, and then brazenly stated that she at least knew she had undeniably passed her prime. The professor beside him then leaned in, suggesting to Ariel to retire now before she completely tarnished her legacy. The other professors then piped up, telling her that if she truly wanted to raise her favorite students exactly as she pleased, then she should simply start her own school. Another professor scoffed, adding that she'd be incredibly lucky to even find students who'd ever follow the washed-up divine eye. Loud laughter then erupted throughout the room. Professor Ariel remained utterly silent. She remained absolutely confident in her ability to recognize true talent. But these particular students simply needed more time. If given the chance, they would undoubtedly prove their worth. She just needed to stop them from getting expelled before that disaster could even happen. She tried to desperately think of something to say when suddenly someone brought up one of her Divine Eye students, named Gray. The professor who brought him up had heard he was quite promising indeed among the first-year swordsmanship students. The long-haired professor then revealed that Gray had been chosen for the upcoming inter-year battle. Professor Budra, now intrigued, agreed that it sounded promising. He then suggested letting Gray prove himself in the upcoming competition. Then, they could finally decide the Divine Eye program's future. After witnessing the competition's results, Professor Ariel's gaze darted to Professor Heathcote. He met her gaze and subtly shook his head. Professor Ariel knew she absolutely had to speak up. She quickly told him that Gray's unique power was utterly unsuited for mere mock battles. However, if it were a genuine kill or be killed situation, she was abruptly cut off by Professor Budra, who was utterly fed up with her excuses. The professor beside him chimed in, stating that if Gray couldn't demonstrate his skills and training, he certainly wouldn't be able to in a real combat situation. Professor Ariel passionately argued that his abilities transcended normal swordsmanship. The entire crowd fell into a hushed silence. Alexandro, seeing no progress, dismissed the meeting, as the discussion was clearly going nowhere productive. However, he did express that witnessing the Divine Eye students in action sounded quite reasonable. He planned to personally observe Gray's performance in the inter-year battle and make his decision then. This turn of events was definitely not good for Professor Ariel. With that final conclusion, the meeting was officially adjourned. Professor Budra, on the other hand, eagerly looked forward to the competition. They all anticipated it would be quite a spectacle. Before Professor Heathcote made his exit, he cast a quick glance at Professor Ariel, who remained sitting looking utterly sullen. She felt deeply apologetic to her students for her perceived weakness. She remembered Gray's raw power in action. Knowing his true power simply didn't fit mock battles. She was also certain that he still desperately needed time, and she knew that what she was hoping for was entirely unreasonable. So, she desperately hoped he could somehow help them. For those bright young kids, those raw gems brimming with world-class potential. To protect their future, she couldn't hold back her tears. Finally, the highly anticipated day of the inter-year battle arrived. The host dramatically announced its official commencement. He then began to introduce the formidable competitors, starting with the first year's reigning top student, Leonard Appias. Next up was the second year's brilliant top student, Lewis Hartman. And the unexpected first-year challenger was Gray Lee. Following him, the second-year challenger, Diable Redartle, was introduced. Gray immediately recognized him. It was the very same guy who ambushed him out of nowhere, back in the hallway. He couldn't believe he was about to face off against him. Now, everyone would witness exactly what they were capable of. Even the professors were watching intently. Professor Budra had a distinct smirk plastered on his face. Leonard, ever observant, noticed that an unusually high number of professors had come to observe this showdown. He then asked Lunel if the inter-year battles were usually like this. Luinol revealed this was a first. Only 3 fencing professors usually bothered to show up. Last year, for instance. This made him wonder why so many were there today. Then, Leon Hart had a sudden realization. That's it. The professors are curious about Gray. He approved of their excellent taste, of course. Lunel wondered, is this Leon Hart's true personality? Professor Budra replied that his guess was correct. He announced they had all come to witness the final battle of the divine. Special admits. That statement made the students clamor. Gray asked, what do you mean? Professor Budra was surprised no one had told him. Everyone looked at Professor Ariel. Then he responded, the Divine Eye class is being abolished. That news absolutely shocked him. He asked Professor Ariel if it was true. She couldn't meet his gaze. She knew if she told him the truth, he'd push himself and might even use that power. But in his current state, it could kill him. She took a deep breath then. She replied, Budra is just trying to mess with your focus. She told him, don't let it get to you, just fight. They were silent. Gray noticed her trembling hands. He kept quiet, simply accepting her response. Professor Budra then told them to go and make fools of themselves. He was confident that once they lost pathetically, the other professors would finally realize that Ariel's divine, I wasn't as keen as it used to be. Gray expressed that he couldn't let that slide. Professor Budra certainly didn't expect that. Then, Gray told him he didn't care if he insulted him, but he wouldn't allow him to talk down on Professor Ariel's judgment. Professor Ariel was surprised by his statement. Professor Budra got triggered and insulted him, asking, what kind of talent? Did Professor Ariel's eyes really pick up in you? He added that unlike his professor, those who haven't gone senile, they were convinced he'd lose. Pathetically, Gray was determined to prove them wrong. This only intensified Professor Budra's anger. His fellow professor even had to calm him down. The host then instructed participants to split up and go with their teammate. Professor Ariel appreciated Gray's trust, but she was also worried and curious about what he was planning. If he were fighting the top student, his practical swordsmanship might have given him a slim chance. But he'd been matched with a terrible opponent. Dibble Redartle. Bradley had rewired his brain surgically to boost his reflexes to superhuman levels. He was practically a living weapon. He was the worst possible matchup for Gray's ambush tactics. This worried her, since Gray might have planned to use that ability. She called out to him, telling him not to worry about her and not to push himself too hard. Gray was caught off guard. Then he simply smiled and replied that he knew the top student match was about to begin. So the representatives were instructed to step forward. The arena was warded with protective magic to prevent fatal wounds. Triggering an opponent's safeguard counted as victory. They were told to fight as if it were real combat. After the instructions, the inter-year battle's top student match had begun. Leon Hart charged first. Lunel braced for the incoming attack. Their swords continuously clashed. Luenel then moved quickly, attacking more aggressively, but Leonhardt ducked to evade his sword. He then planted his feet for support and kicked Luenel in the jaw, but it put a strain on him. He realized he couldn't afford a fight like Gray. Luenel was able to evade his foot. He acknowledged that Leonhardt was good. He was even stronger than he'd been in his first year. He picked up the pace, asking if Leonhardt could keep up. When he attacked again, Leonhardt deflected it. But Leonhardt lost his footing. He was cornered against the barrier, and he knew he was in serious trouble. He watched the incoming sword poised to strike, but he was utterly helpless. The sword struck the wall, mere inches from his neck. Then the host declared, "That's enough." He then announced the winner of the top student match was Luenel. Leonard thanked him for the excellent match. Luenel acknowledged it had been a good fight. Next up was the challenger match. The representatives were called forward. Leonhardt wished Gray good luck. Gray had talked a big game, so he knew he had to back it up. He'd fought more hopeless monsters than he could count before turning back time. So compared to that, he expected he had a much better chance of winning this fight. Dibble dragged his sword, creating a deafening screech as he taunted Professor Bradley. "Just wait a little longer, and I'll send Gray right where you are." And that's straight to hell. The selection match for the interior battle began. Gray attacked first, but Radal easily blocked it. It caught him off guard, sending him reeling backward. Radal's sword was so incredibly heavy that it made his hands shake. Professor Ariel had informed Gray that Radal's reflexes were boosted, but it made him wonder if they buffed his arm strength too. With such an immense difference in power, no trick he pulled would ever work. He had no idea how the hell he was supposed to fight him. He did have one more skill up his sleeve, but he was explicitly told never to use that power, no matter what happens. If he does, he might die. Back then, he had agreed with Professor Ariel. She had told him the tournament was important, but it wasn't worth his life. Besides, the arena's defensive barrier wouldn't hold against it. If he used it, he might end up killing his opponent. Back to the present, Radal charged at him. Gray was thinking of risking his life to protect the Divine Eye slot, but he couldn't possibly kill someone in a school tournament. Radal murmured something under his breath, and then he swung his sword. Gray had just deflected. Redartle attacked again. Gray noted his movements were strangely simplistic. With Redartle's stats and reflexes, Gray knew he could be easily defeated. And Redartle certainly wasn't lacking in technique. This made Gray suspect Redartle was holding back. He wondered what Redartle was planning. Redartle sported this unnerving smile, sending chills down Gray's spine, and that caused him to lose his balance. Redartle aimed directly for his eye, and Gray knew he couldn't dodge. Yet, acting on instinct, to his utter surprise, he managed to block the sword. It utterly baffled him how it happened, since he absolutely shouldn't have made it in time. He considered the possibility that Redartle intentionally weakened his attack. Professor Ariel shot up from her seat. Her divine eye had glimpsed something. What kind of ominous power was that? A chaotic power pulsed within Redartle's chest. She was distracted by Professor Budra's comments, calling it such a one-sided match. One professor remarked that this year's second years seemed to have truly nasty personalities. Even though Redartle could end at any time, he kept dragging it out. They saw the Divine Eye student had his hands full, just trying to block the second year's attacks. Yet he refused to surrender. It proves Gray wasn't just strong enough. Professor Budra suggested the student might actually know the Divine Eye was about to be abolished, and was trying to hint it to them, because at this rate the whole Divine Eye special slot thing was going to become a total mess. If they kept waiting, the other professors burst out laughing, agreeing with him. This led them to believe he was such a considerate student thinking of the academy. Professor Ariel demanded they stop the fight at once, by claiming it was too dangerous. Professor Budra sarcastically questioned her. What exactly is dangerous when it's just a mock battle? Another professor chimed in, explaining that the arena was safeguarded by a powerful protection spell. Any attack threatening fatal injury would automatically be nullified. He knew, of course, that she was already aware, and merely brought it up to make her look foolish. He added that the students could fight without holding back, fearless, unless she had some other reason for wanting the match to be stopped. Gray was truly struggling in the arena. Professor Ariel's voice grew sharper as she retorted, "I know all about the protection spell, but I also know it won't be enough to safeguard Gray from the power I just witnessed." But it was already too late. Even as they spoke, an ominous power erupted from within the arena. It sent shivers down her spine. Rod Artel sported a truly creepy expression. His sword glowed with a dark, menacing aura, and the attack he unleashed was incredibly powerful. Gray was visibly terrified and completely overwhelmed. The attack was so potent that it extended far beyond the arena's bounds, carving a deep line into the ground, just an inch away from Gray's foot. It was terrifying to think. He could have been sliced in half like that. And what's more, it even broke through the protective spell. Professor Budra shrieked, having nearly been sliced in half himself. If not for the barrier, the other professors were shaken. Professor Ariel made sure they knew. "I warned you." She cursed Varian for planting such a monstrous power in a student. She quickly unleashed her own powers, trying to repair the failing barrier. She realized the spectator barrier was too robust, and she couldn't use binding magic on it. She screamed at the other professors, "This is an emergency. You must disable the barrier immediately and cancel the tournament." She declared this was no longer swordsmanship. Professor Budra and the other professors, still reeling from the incident, heard her yell at Gray to run. Stopping the fight from the outside would take too much time, and he knew that wasn't an option. If he turned his back, he'd die instantly, especially since Ray Dartel was relentlessly attacking. The audience was terrified, screaming loudly, as they felt the impact of those brutal attacks. Heathcote knew the professor's spells would take at least 30 seconds to reach the arena. That was simply too slow. They had no other choice but this. He thought it was still early to use it, but he trusted Gray to pull it off. He instructed Gray to think of his body as the sword. He told him not to swing his blade. Instead, he must move his entire body with that incredible power. Gray was intensely evading the attacks in his mind. Heathcote shouldn't just drop that kind of advice on him out of nowhere, but if the professor says he can do it, then he will do it. Well, he had to. He focused, imagining himself as a single, sharpened blade. He just stood there, channeling that thought. Even with an attack hurtling towards him, the attack came dangerously close. Suddenly, it caused a massive explosion, and Gray appeared right behind Radartle, completely shocking his opponent. Gray started wondering if his enemy had always been that slow. But then he realized that wasn't the case. It was he who had gotten faster with his attack. A black light shone intensely at the center. Gray nearly struck Radartle. Radartle had a barrier around his body, but Gray persisted, determined to break through. Eventually, he was successful. He blasted Radartle straight towards the ground. Radartle made a huge hole in the wall when he crashed. Professor Budra's jaw dropped in disbelief when Gray shattered the defense barrier. The other professor asked, "What kind of fight was that?" Professor Heathcote then asked if the other student was okay. The facilitator hurriedly called for a medical team. Radartle emerged from the hole, but everyone knew something wasn't right. Radartle was now exuding an ominous aura around his entire body, and even his expression didn't look human anymore. Everyone gasped, utterly stunned to find him completely unharmed. Professor Ariel cautioned Gray that this wasn't the end just yet. He had to stay sharp, and Gray acknowledged her warning, but he was still completely caught off guard. When Radartle launched a sudden attack with his dark powers, he barely managed to dodge the devastating blow. It was so immensely powerful it tore through the very ground. Professor Budra shouted, "What the hell was that?" Meanwhile, Professor Ariel quickly checked in, with the other professors asking if the barrier had already been disengaged. But they still needed 10 more agonizing seconds. Gray desperately tried his best to avoid the relentless attacks. He watched Radartle's movements with intense focus. Radartle swung his sword once more, unleashing a continuous barrage of black wind blades. And then, in a terrifying blink, Raydal closed the distance between them. Gray managed to block the sword, but with the incredible attack speed and raw strength, he knew there was no way Raydal was still merely human. He was also acutely aware that he wasn't normal either. Gray shoved the sword away, and yet, after all that, Raydal remained completely unscathed. Raydal attacked him again, and Gray horrifyingly realized he was simply too slow. He was struck, and the impact made him cough up blood. Professor Ariel's face contorted with worry for him. Gray knew he'd be completely done for if he didn't fight back. He craved more power. Those thoughts consumed his mind. His eyes transformed, and in one swift, decisive move, he severed both of Raydal's arms. Raydal let out a gut-wrenching scream of agony. Blood splattered violently everywhere. Then Raydal collapsed to his knees as dark mist billowed from his severed limbs. The professors watched, jaws agape in utter disbelief. The entire arena fell into stunned, horrified silence. At that very moment, the barrier finally disengaged. Immediately, all the professors leaped down into the arena. Professor Ariel was already ahead of them all. They quickly chained Raydal without delay. Gray was already gasping, completely out of breath. Unexpectedly, a sudden, searing pang of pain hit him. Blood erupted from various parts of his body. He collapsed, face down, onto the unforgiving ground. His entire body trembled violently. Professor Ariel instantly rushed to his side to heal him, anxiously asking if he was all right. 3 more professors then hurried to their side. She instructed them to quickly begin casting. As healing magic enveloped him, Gray barely clung to consciousness. She anxiously monitored his every breath. A wave of relief washed over her moments later. Then she noticed a shadow falling over her. And when she finally looked up, Gray was already perfectly fine, standing tall. He offered her his thanks. Everyone was absolutely stunned. He was already okay. Even the other professor had to confirm if he was truly all right. Gray then turned to Professor Ariel, asking for an assessment. She activated her divine eye to scan him, and what she saw defied belief. Despite wielding such immense power, his soul didn't even have a single scratch. Next, he inquired about his physical body. She explained the healing magic had completely taken care of it, so nothing should be hurting him anymore. Professor Heathcote then strode over to them, announcing it worked. They successfully managed to lessen the backlash, exactly as he'd predicted. Professor Ariel, however, was far from pleased that this was already considered a state where the backlash was reduced. In fact, she was furious. She was absolutely seething because without healing magic, Gray could have died. Professor Heathcote calmly explained they had managed to confine the damage to wounds that healing magic could readily fix. So, for now, that was good enough. He added that he also wanted Gray to eventually withstand the full recoil entirely on his own someday. But that, he admitted, would take some time. Professor Ariel simply shot him a scathing glare. Gray finally realized the insane training was all for this. A lot of things had certainly gone off script. Some professors quickly tended to the arena's shattered barrier, while the medic secured Reed Arden onto a stretcher. Professor Ariel then wanted to confirm the match's victor. The facilitator stepped forward and explained that Reed Arden's protective barrier was activated due to Gray's attack. Therefore, the official winner of the selection match was the first-year representative, Gray. The students erupted into cheers. They couldn't believe he had defeated a second year, and from the divine class, no less. At that moment, Professor Heathcote loudly declared that the divine eye student, Gray, finally snapped the first year's 35-game losing streak. But, to be honest, that win-loss record barely matters now. After witnessing that epic fight, no one could possibly deny that Ariel's divine. I was wrong. Headmaster Alejandro admits that after seeing the match. They had no choice but to concede she was right. Now, absolutely no one was going to support the proposal to abolish the Divine Eye program. A professor from the special class added that they should be utterly ashamed for even considering its abolition. They had nearly expelled a student of such immense talent. Gray, meanwhile, was engaged in conversation with other professors. Professor Ariel gripped her arm tightly, struggling to contain her overwhelming emotions. She was so incredibly relieved and thankful to him. Another professor agreed, suggesting that those who championed abolishing the divine eye program should reflect on their own grave responsibility. Everyone's gaze immediately fell upon Professor Boudra. He and two other professors were instantly put on the spot. They were left speechless, sweating profusely. Professor Boudra quickly concocted an excuse, claiming he had other preparations to handle, and scurried away, his lackeys trailing closely behind. The other professors chuckled knowingly as they made their escape. An older professor remarked that the saying, "Never pick a fight with the divine eye," still holds true. The professor beside him added that, compared to the old days, Professor Ariel has certainly mellowed out. Times have truly changed since then. It made Gray ponder if something significant had happened to her in the past, now that the embarrassing distraction was gone. Headmaster Alejandro approached Gray to discuss a few matters that specifically concerned him. He looked incredibly serious. So Gray immediately put his guard up, asking what it was. During the match, the second-year representative, Deeble Redardal, clearly had some unnatural power violently forced into his body, and they fully intended to investigate it. But the undeniable fact remains. A mock battle, which should have been completely safe, ended up putting a student's life in grave jeopardy. And with that, the headmaster admitted the academy was entirely responsible for not detecting the anomaly sooner. He then offered his sincerest apologies. Gray quickly told him not to worry, since nothing ultimately happened in the end. Alexandro thanked him again. Then, Alexandro brought up how, after Radal went berserk, Gray had also unleashed something else. Our boy Gray grew noticeably nervous hearing this. Alexandro knew it wasn't just magic. It was something far, far stranger. A type of power modern magic theory couldn't even begin to analyze or comprehend. So, he wanted to know, what exactly was that power? Gray was utterly stumped, completely a loss for words. He couldn't reveal anything from before the regression, not when he still didn't know where the liquidator's mastermind was lurking. So, he simply replied that he had no idea. And Alexandro, however, clearly doubted that. He just couldn't have known when he used it himself. Gray told Alexandro he truly didn't know that he possessed anything like that within him. He claimed it was just Professor Ariel, who had first noticed it and then explained it to him. But Professor Ariel knew that was a blatant lie. By the time he took down the ogre, General Gray was already wielding that power freely. It made her wonder what exactly he was planning. Deep inside, Gray desperately wished she'd play along to stop the liquidator. He needed her to keep being the one with power. She quickly realized what he was angling for. She was impressed he'd thought of absolutely everything. It made her think he wasn't acting like someone living life for the very first time. She could tell he trusted her implicitly. So, she had no choice but to step up and help him. She joined their tense conversation and told the headmaster he was absolutely right when he claimed that Gray's power couldn't be analyzed through magic theory, but she stated she could see it clearly with her own eyes. She shared that after observing his power, she asked Professor Heathcote, who has a strong affinity for it, to help Gray out. And that's what made that day's level of control possible. She readily admitted that much. She's still researching how to properly draw the power out, but she did ask if he could leave everything regarding Gray's power entirely to her. Well, after witnessing that epic fight, he couldn't possibly refuse. He told her that Gray and the entire Divine Eye Special Group were hers to command, encouraging her to tell him if there was anything the Academy could do to assist. They certainly didn't expect him to say that. She sincerely thanked him for that. Gray and Professor Ariel exchanged a knowing smile. After that, he's off to the special underground medical ward to examine Rhea Dartle's condition. He'll need her sharp eyes to come with him. It was her pleasure. After that, she headed back to her office and marked it with an eye. She took a sip of her tea and informed Gray that, as per the analysis results, the power used on Radal was nearly identical to the liquidators. She was certain that the crystals from that research facility were used. Gray asked what happened to him. Unfortunately, he died. Gray was about to ask if he was the cause, and before he could even finish, she already answered, no. She explained that the moment that power activated, Redartle stopped being himself. He may have already been gone when the power was implanted into him, and it was clear that it was aimed at Gray, a retaliation for killing Varian Bradley. This made Gray sullen, and he also realized that if Radal was tampered with after Variad died, it could only mean that it was the doing of third party. She could also tell that there was a bigger fish hiding behind all this. She planned to keep digging into the connections, but it's definitely going to take time. Her intuition tells her the deeper parts of the academy were involved. He understood and told her to just tell him if he could help with anything. She sincerely thanked him. She also noticed that he'd learned how to use his power without damaging his own soul. He agreed, but the recoil on his body, this time, it was even worse than before. Her silence, however, left him completely bewildered. She then revealed that Heathcote had deemed it was time for his training to advance to the next stage, which absolutely thrilled him. He had to ask, was that really true? She smiled, replying simply, yes, and declared he'd soon learn how to finally control that power far better than he ever could before. Thanks for watching, brothers. If you enjoyed this update, make sure to drop a like and hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter. We upload right here on Manhwa Updater. New episodes from the main Manhwa dealer channel will always drop here every week, so stick around and stay updated. And hey, if you want even more fire stories, be sure to check out the latest upload on the main channel. Right after this, as always, stay cool, stay awesome, and I'll catch you in the next one.